23 minutes. That's all that stood between an $18 million machine and total humiliation in front of 300 million people watching around the world. The car wouldn't start. Every genius in the building had already failed. And the one man who could save everything? He wasn't supposed to be there at all. If you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever been the person nobody called until it was already too late, this story is for you. Drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far this story travels. Hit that like button and stay with me until the very last word. You won't regret it. The clock on the wall of Hangar 7 read 1:37 p.m. Race start, 2 p.m. 23 minutes. Vanessa Blackwood stood at the edge of the garage floor with her arms crossed and her jaw tight enough to crack a molar. Around her, 91 engineers, technicians, data analysts, and specialists moved in frantic orbits around a single object, car number 7, a matte black carbon fiber machine that had cost her organization 4 years of development and just over $18 million to build. It was sitting completely still, not warming up, not idling, not making a single sound. Dead. The paddock outside Blackwood Motorsport's garage was a different world entirely. Engines growled and snarled from neighboring teams. Pit crews shouted in 3 languages. A helicopter circled the circuit overhead with a television logo painted on its belly. Somewhere beyond the concrete barriers and chain-link fences, 300,000 people filled the grandstands, their voices becoming one continuous, low roar that you felt more in your chest than heard with your ears. The Monaco Grand Prix, the last race of the season. Blackwood Motorsport was 14 points ahead of Meridian Racing in the Constructors' Championship, but only if their car actually made it to the starting grid. If number 7 didn't start, those points evaporated. The championship went to Meridian, 4 years of work, gone. 300 million in sponsorship revenue, gone. The story of the season, rewritten by a machine that had decided, without warning or explanation, to stop cooperating 23 minutes before the most important race of the year. Vanessa had been standing in the same spot for 19 minutes. She hadn't moved because moving felt like admitting she didn't know what to do next. And Vanessa Blackwood had spent 30 years training herself never to visibly not know what to do. "Talk to me, Chen." Her voice was flat, controlled. The kind of calm that comes after you've burned through panic and arrived somewhere colder on the other side. Dr. David Chen, head of powertrain engineering, MYT doctorate, 11 years in formula racing, looked up from a laptop balanced on a rolling cart. His collar was damp. His glasses had slipped down his nose, and he hadn't bothered to push them back up. "We've run full diagnostics 3 times, he said. "The system isn't throwing a single fault code. Everything reads nominal. And yet it won't start. And yet it won't start." Vanessa looked at the car. The car did not look back. "What about the ECU?" "Swapped it out 40 minutes ago. Didn't change anything." "Fuel system?" "Clean. Pressure's good." "Battery?" "Full charge. We've checked the voltage at every junction we can physically access." Chen pulled off his glasses and rubbed his eyes with 2 fingers. He was a man who had built hybrid powertrains capable of producing over 1,000 horsepower from a package the size of a carry-on suitcase. He was not a man who was supposed to look this lost. "Vanessa, I've got 6 of the best powertrain engineers in the world standing 10 feet from me, and none of us can explain what's happening." The paddock radio on the wall crackled. A voice from race control, calm and bureaucratic in the way that only people with genuine authority can afford to be. "Teams, 15-minute notification, grid formation in 15 minutes. 15 minutes. Someone knocked over a water bottle somewhere behind her. She heard it hit the floor, heard the liquid run across the concrete, heard nobody stop to pick it up because nobody had time to stop for anything. Vanessa pressed 2 fingers to her temple and thought about the press conference she would have to give if the car didn't start. She thought about Elliot Graves, the CEO of their primary sponsor, who was sitting in the VIP suite directly above them right now, drinking champagne he'd paid $3 million to drink, waiting to watch a championship get clinched. She thought about her driver, Kai Nakamura, who was standing alone near the front of the car with his helmet under his arm and an expression on his face like a man sitting in a waiting room who didn't know what the appointment was for. She thought about her father, who had built this team from nothing 30 years ago, and who had handed her the keys to it 8 years ago, and who had died the following spring, never getting to see whether she could hold the thing together. She pulled out her phone. The text she needed to send was to her PR director, Diane Okafor, who was somewhere in the paddock preparing for the worst-case scenario. Vanessa had typed out half of a message instructing Diane to prepare a statement about a technical withdrawal when a different notification slid down from the top of her screen. A message from Marco Vitale, the team's sporting director. Marco was outside, managing the logistics of getting to the grid. Vanessa. There's a man at the garage entrance, says he's a mechanic, local, says he can help. Security's holding him, but I think you should come look at this. She stared at the message for 3 full seconds. Then she typed back, "What does local mechanic mean exactly?" Marco's reply came in under 10 seconds. "Means he drove here in a truck that probably costs less than one of our steering wheels. He's not paddock. He's not credentialed. He heard we were having a problem and he just showed up." Vanessa looked at the car. She looked at Chen. She looked at the clock. 1:40 p.m., 20 minutes to race start. She walked to the garage entrance. The security checkpoint at the entrance to the Blackwood garage was a portable barrier system staffed by 2 uniformed guards who looked like they took their jobs personally. Beyond the barrier, the paddock pathway was crowded with journalists, team personnel, and the occasional celebrity guest who had paid for the kind of access that let you stand close enough to smell the fuel. Mason Reed was standing to the left of the barrier with his hands in his pockets. He was not what Vanessa expected, though she hadn't been sure what she was expecting. He was a big man, not gym big, but the kind of large that comes from actual physical work done over years. The sort of build where the shoulders are wide because they've carried things, not because someone paid for them to be. He wore dark work pants, a gray Henley with the sleeves pushed up to the elbows, and boots that had seen enough concrete to have an opinion about it. His hair was dark, a little past neat, and he had the kind of face that seemed like it might default to quiet, not unfriendly, but not performing anything either. He looked like a man who was used to being in rooms where people didn't immediately look at him, and who had long since made peace with that. He was maybe 32, possibly younger. It was hard to tell because something about the way he stood made him seem like someone who'd had time to become a certain kind of person. Not old, just settled. He was watching the garage with focused attention, not gawking, not trying to get a photo or catch a glimpse of the car. Just watching, the way a doctor watches a patient, gathering information. Vanessa stopped in front of him. "I'm Vanessa Blackwood." "I know who you are," he said. His voice was measured, not rude, not deferential, just even. "I'm Mason Reed. I have a repair shop about 1.5 miles from here. I heard through the radio that you were having a startup issue with the race car." The radio. The local traffic station picked it up. They said the Blackwood car hadn't been heard since this morning. In race paddocks, that usually means one thing. Vanessa studied him. "And you thought you'd come by?" "I thought I'd offer to look at it." He paused. "I understand if that seems like a strange offer." "It seems like an extremely strange offer." She tilted her head slightly. "What kind of repair shop?" "General automotive, some vintage restoration on the side, whatever comes in." "And you've worked on Formula racing cars?" "A long time ago." Something crossed his face. Not discomfort exactly, more like the deliberate closing of a door. "For a while, yes." "Who for?" "It doesn't matter who for. It matters whether I can help you right now." His eyes moved past her to the garage interior, then came back to her face. "I'm not asking for anything. I'm not trying to get on camera or get a paddock pass or sell you something. You have about 18 minutes before your window closes. I would like to look at the car." Vanessa had built a career on reading people quickly and correctly. It was a skill she'd developed as a necessity. In motorsport, as in most high-stakes industries, the wrong hire, the wrong advisor, the wrong instinct about a person could cost you an entire season. She was good at it, not perfect. Nobody was perfect. But standing in front of Mason Reed, she couldn't locate the angle. There wasn't one, as far as she could tell. He wasn't nervous, he wasn't performing competence. He wasn't trying to impress her. He was just standing there with the same patient attention he'd been giving the garage before she arrived. She made a decision. "You get 10 minutes, she said. You don't touch anything without telling me first. You don't talk to my engineers unless I authorize it. And if at any point I decide you're wasting my time, you leave without an argument. Understood. And you stay out of camera sight lines. There are broadcast cameras in this paddock, and I am not adding a news cycle to my problems today. Also understood. She turned and walked back into the garage. After a half-second, she heard his footsteps follow her. The effect of Mason Reed entering the garage was not dramatic. Nobody stopped working. Nobody turned to look at him. Vanessa had a policy. Her engineers focused on the problem, not on the politics. And they were deep enough in crisis mode that an unfamiliar face barely registered. He was just another body moving through a space that already had too many bodies. Vanessa pulled Chen aside near the rear of the car. "I need 2 minutes of your time," she said quietly. "I know you hate this. Just give me 2 minutes." Chen looked at Mason, then back at Vanessa. His expression went through several things and arrived at something that resembled exhaustion accepting company. Fine. Mason had already begun walking slowly around the car, not touching it, just looking. He moved the way certain people move in unfamiliar spaces, deliberately, taking it in, not rushing toward any conclusion. He paused at the front nose assembly, moved to the left side, crouched slightly to look at the under-tray angle, straightened and studied the area around the air intake. "When did it last run?" he asked. He was speaking generally, but Chen answered. "This morning, 9:15. Final systems check, everything nominal. We shut down at 9:40 to prepare for warm grid procedures. When we tried to restart at 11:30, nothing." "Was there any work done to the car between 9:40 and 11:30? Chen hesitated. "Standard checks, visual inspection of the floor and wing elements, tire pressure verification. We swapped the front wing end plate for the race configuration, but that's cosmetic, no electrical connection, nothing that should affect startup." "Who did the wing swap?" "Junior team member. Routine." "Was anyone else near the car between those times?" Chen frowned. "I mean, everyone was in and out of the garage. It's a busy morning." "Was anything moved? Any equipment pushed around the car?" "Probably. We had fuel rigs in and out, brake cooling equipment, the data cart." Chen crossed his arms slowly. "Can I ask what you're looking at? Because we've been through all of this." "I know you have," Mason said, without any condescension in it. "I just need to understand the sequence, not the systems. The sequence. What physically happened to this car and this space between the time it last worked and the time it stopped working." Chen was quiet for a moment. This was, Vanessa noticed, not the question anyone had been asking. For the last 2 hours, the conversation had been entirely about what the car's systems were reporting, what the diagnostics showed, what the data said. Nobody had asked what happened, like the car had simply failed in isolation, from within, rather than in response to the world around it. She watched Chen's expression shift, slightly, almost imperceptibly, toward something less defensive. "Walk me through the wing swap," Mason said. Chen called over Julio Martinez, the junior technician who'd done the front wing work. Julio was 24, talented, and currently looked like a man who had spent 2 hours wondering if this was somehow his fault. He gave a quick, nervous explanation of the procedure. Removed the qualifying end plate configuration, installed the race configuration, checked the wing positioning, locked the fasteners. "Did you have the car on any kind of lift or jack?" Mason asked him. "No, sir. The front wing's accessible from ground level." "Did you need to get under the front of the car at all?" "No, sir." Did anyone move anything underneath the car at that time? Any equipment slide under there? Anything push through the floor area?" Julio hesitated. That hesitation was small, barely a pause, the kind of thing you would completely miss if you were looking at a screen. Mason noticed it. "Take your time," he said. Julio glanced at Chen, then back. "The fuel rig. When they were moving it out, I think it might have clipped the underside. Just a bump, nothing major. The tech moving it said it barely touched. We checked and there wasn't any visible damage to the floor." The garage was loud. It was always loud. But in the small bubble of that conversation, something had gone quiet. Mason looked at Vanessa. She looked back at him. "I need a flashlight," he said, "and I need about 2 square feet of space under the front left area of the car." Getting 2 square feet of space under car number 7 was, in practice, A negotiation. Chen cleared the area himself, which took approximately 45 seconds and required telling 3 engineers and a data analyst to step back without explaining why in any satisfying way. One of the engineers, a senior electrical specialist named Priya, who had been with the team for 7 years, gave Vanessa a look that very clearly communicated several opinions without using any words. Vanessa kept her face neutral. Mason took the flashlight offered by a nearby technician and crouched beside the car. Then he lay down on his side on the garage floor, which nobody in the building had done in the past 2 hours, because the floor of a Formula racing garage is not somewhere engineers typically go unless they're doing specific underfloor work, and they'd already determined the issue wasn't in the floor. The flashlight beam moved slowly. Vanessa crouched slightly, watching. She couldn't see what he was seeing from her angle. 23 seconds. Then, there it is. His voice was quiet, not triumphant, more like someone reading a word they'd expected to find. What? Chen was already moving. Main grounding lug, front left harness, behind the lower wishbone bracket. It's been displaced. Mason's arm shifted. The clip that secures it to the chassis contact point. It's been pushed maybe a centimeter off position. The lug itself is still connected, but the ground contact is intermittent. The car's computing systems are seeing everything as nominal because they're getting just enough signal. But when you try to initiate the startup sequence, the power draw spikes and the ground can't hold the connection. The system shuts down before it throws a fault because the shutdown is faster than the diagnostic cycle. Silence. Not complete silence. The paddock was still roaring outside, the clock was still running, helicopters were still circling. But in the garage, something had stopped. Priya was the first engineer to move. She crossed the floor in 4 steps and got down on one knee with her own light. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, in a very careful voice, "The fuel rig." "Yeah," Mason said. When it clipped the underfloor, it pushed the lug bracket just enough. Not enough to damage it. Not enough to show on any visual inspection of the floor. Enough to shift the clip position and break the stable ground contact. Priya sat back on her heels. She had the expression of someone who has just been told something obvious that they very much wish someone had told them 2 hours ago. Chen had gone the particular color that comes from understanding something and simultaneously wishing you didn't. "We swapped the ECU," he said. "We checked every diagnostic circuit. We checked the battery and the fuel system and the hybrid unit." "The grounding lug is behind the wishbone bracket," Mason said, not rubbing it in, just stating the geography. "You can't see it from any standard inspection angle. You'd have to know to look specifically there. And you knew. I followed the sequence." He got up from the floor. His shirt had a concrete smear on the side. He didn't seem to notice or particularly care. "The car ran fine. Something happened during the downtime. The symptoms, clean diagnostics but no startup, pointed to a power path issue rather than a component failure. And the fuel rig story pointed me to the underfloor area. The rest was just looking." Chen stared at him for a moment. Then he turned to the rest of the garage, and his voice went from conversational to operational in a single syllable. "Priya, get the grounding repair kit. Julio, I need the bracket access tool from Bay 4. Everyone else, clear the nose area. We're doing an emergency ground repair. Move." The garage, which had been moving in panic circles for 2 hours, suddenly moved with direction. Vanessa looked at Mason. He was watching the team reassemble around the car with quiet attention. He didn't look satisfied. He didn't look like he was waiting for anything. He just looked like a man who had done the thing he came to do. 12 minutes, she said, to race start. "It's a straightforward repair," he said. "Maybe 5 minutes. Your team can handle it. How confident are you?" He looked at her. "If I'm wrong, you'll know in 5 minutes, and you're exactly where you were before I arrived." A pause. "But I'm not wrong. The repair took 6 minutes and 40 seconds. Priya performed it herself, on her back, with 2 assistants holding equipment and Chen watching over her shoulder. The procedure was not complicated. It was, in the vocabulary of electrical engineering, a straightforward correction of a grounding path. Reposition the lug, reseat the clip, verify the contact integrity, apply the locking compound. Simple. Except that it was happening with 11 minutes to race start in a garage watched by broadcast cameras positioned outside the barriers. while a driver stood near the nose of the car and tried to look like he was not thinking about the fact that his entire season was being decided by a repair he didn't fully understand, performed by people who hadn't spoken to him in the last 20 minutes. Kai Nakamura was 27, a third-generation racing driver whose grandfather had raced sports cars in Japan in the 1970s, and whose father had reached Formula 2 before a wrist injury ended his career. Kai himself had spent 6 years working toward this moment, a championship-deciding race, his team in the lead, his car on home soil in the sense that Monaco was anyone's home soil when you were a professional racing driver. He had his helmet under his arm. He had his gloves on. He had the particular stillness of an athlete who has learned to manage adrenaline the way other people manage a budget, carefully, conservatively, aware of what it costs to spend it too early. He watched the repair happen. He did not ask questions. He had learned over 6 years that asking questions during a critical repair did not help the people doing the repair. When Priya finally emerged from under the car and stripped off her gloves, she looked at Chen. "Secure," she said. "Ground path verified." Chen looked at Vanessa. "Your call." Vanessa looked at Mason. He said nothing. He just waited. She walked to the car and leaned down toward the cockpit. "Kai!" Nakamura looked up at her. He had dark eyes with the kind of steadiness in them that you either had in this sport or eventually lost. "Tell me what you need from me." "I need you to try the ignition." He nodded once. He pulled on his helmet. He settled into the seat with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done it 10,000 times, and also as if this time was different, because this time was different. He connected the Hans device. He reached up and pulled the cockpit surround into position. The garage had gone quiet in the way that spaces go quiet, when everyone in them is holding the same breath. Kai's right hand moved to the ignition panel. He pressed the starter button. For 1/2 second, nothing happened. 1/2 second is a very long time when you are standing in a garage watching it. Then the engine fired. Not a sputter, not a cough. The engine of car number 7 came alive the way it was designed to come alive, with a sound like controlled violence, like something enormous and precise waking up from a dream and finding itself exactly where it was supposed to be. The hybrid system engaged, the gauges lit, the telemetry screens across 6 workstations suddenly flooded with data, all of it green, all of it nominal, all of it exactly what it was supposed to look like. The sound hit the garage walls and came back. Nobody cheered. These were engineers. They didn't cheer. But Priya laughed once, a short, involuntary sound, and immediately covered her mouth with the back of her hand. Julio Martinez turned away and stood facing the back wall of the garage for about 4 seconds. Chen took off his glasses, looked at them, and put them back on. Outside from the grandstands, a distant roar. The crowd had heard the engine. Vanessa Blackwood stood in the middle of her garage and felt something she hadn't felt in 2 hours, which was the sensation of a future that was possible. They made it to the starting grid with 4 minutes to spare. Not comfortable, not the way you'd want, but they made it. The process of getting car number 7 out of the garage and onto the starting grid in 4 minutes was, from the outside, a piece of organized violence. The car moving at walking pace through the paddock lane, surrounded by crew members jogging alongside. The sporting director on the radio managing the clearances. The crowd noise rising as the car emerged from the paddock and turned onto the pit lane, and then finally reached its grid position on the circuit itself, where the mechanics sprang forward to make final tire temperature checks and wing angle confirmations while Kai sat in the cockpit and the clock counted down. Vanessa watched from the pit wall. She was aware, distantly, that she should be feeling the particular combination of relief and pre-race tension that this moment normally produced. Instead, she was thinking about the man she'd left in the garage. When the car had fired, she'd turned to say something to Mason Reed. Something appropriate, something that communicated how extraordinary the last 10 minutes had been. He was already walking toward the garage exit. She had called his name. He'd stopped, turned. "Your car needs to get to the grid," he'd said. "Go." And she had, because he was right, and because the car needed to get to the grid, but she'd told Marco to get his information. Name, contact, anything. Do not let that man leave without it. Now she stood on the pit wall with 90 seconds to race start and the flag lights above the circuit ready to count down and the sound of 30 engines warming to fever pitch. And she thought about a man who had walked into her garage with his hands in his pockets and had found, in 6 minutes, what 91 specialists had missed in 2 hours. She thought about the question he'd asked. Not what does the system show, but what happened. Not what does the data say, but what did you see. Not a search for a complicated explanation, but a sequence, an order of events, a story that led somewhere if you followed it carefully instead of jumping to the sophisticated answer. The lights above the circuit came on, 5 red lights, one by one, the way they always did. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The lights went out. The race began. The garage was quieter when the race started. About half the engineering team moved to the pit wall. The rest stayed to monitor telemetry feeds and manage pit stop preparation. The enormous screens on the back wall of the garage showed the live feed from 11 cameras mounted on and around the car, plus the broadcast feed from the circuit's television director, who is currently showing car number 7 in clean air through the first corner, holding position in 4th place, exactly where the race strategy called for it to be. Nobody was looking at Mason Reed. He stood near the back of the garage, out of the way of the remaining crew. He was watching the telemetry screens with the quiet attention he'd given everything else since arriving, not reading them the way the engineers read them, not tracking specific parameters, just watching. Marco Vitali approached him. Marco was a practical man. He'd spent 15 years managing the logistics of Grand Prix racing, which meant he was fluent in the language of not wasting time. "Vanessa wants your contact information," Marco said, "and she'll want to speak with you after the race. She doesn't have to do that." "I know she doesn't have to." Marco produced a business card. "This is mine. She'll want to talk, whatever you're comfortable sharing." Mason looked at the card. He took it. "I have a daughter to get back to," he said, "but I can be reached." "How old?" 8. Something in his face changed when he said it. Not softened exactly, but opened slightly, the way a window lets in light without making a room cold. "She's at school right now. I've got until 3:30 before I need to be there." Marco nodded. He was a man with 2 kids of his own, and he recognized the specific quality of that particular attachment, the kind of time commitment that reorganized everything else around it. "We'll be done well before then," he said. "Race is 2 hours if there are no safety cars." Mason looked at the screen. On it, car number 7 navigated a chicane with the precise, unhurried aggression of a driver who knew exactly where the limits were. "Looks like it's running well," Mason said. "It's running perfectly," Marco said. Mason nodded. He didn't say anything else. He went back to watching the screens, and Marco went back to the pit wall, and the race went on. The Monaco Grand Prix takes approximately 2 hours to complete. For Vanessa Blackwood, those 2 hours had the specific texture of time that has been lived at too high an intensity for too long, stretched at the moments of greatest stress, compressed in the intervals of strategic execution, and ultimately assembled into something she could only evaluate in retrospect. Kai Nakamura started 4th. He passed the 3rd-place car in the pit stop phase when Meridian Racing's first driver, Alec Ferreira, pitted a lap early and emerged behind him. He ran 2nd for 21 laps behind the eventual race leader, a Vortex racing car whose driver was having the kind of afternoon where everything works. And then, on lap 61 of 78, the Vortex car suffered a hydraulic failure at the entry of turn 6. Kai Nakamura led the Monaco Grand Prix from lap 61 to lap 78. He crossed the finish line 4.3 seconds ahead of Ferreira's Meridian car, which was, depending on how you thought about it, either a comfortable margin or an extraordinarily slim one, given what it had taken to get the car to the starting grid in the first place. When the car crossed the line, Vanessa allowed herself exactly 6 seconds of something that was not quite relief and not quite joy, but existed somewhere in between, a physical release of tension that started in her shoulders and moved outward. She pressed the radio button on her earpiece. "Kai." "Well driven." His voice came back breathless and full of a kind of happiness that reminded her that, under all the engineering and strategy and data, this was still a sport conducted by human beings in bodies. "Tell me we won the championship." "We won the championship," a sound on the radio that was not a word. In the garage, people were embracing. Chen had his arms around Priya. Julio Martinez was on his phone, already calling someone. Probably his mother, Vanessa thought. The screen showed Kai emerging from the car in Parc Fermé, his helmet still on, his arms raised. Vanessa looked toward the back of the garage. Mason Reed was still there. He was watching the celebration with an expression she couldn't immediately name. Not detached, not envious. Something quieter. Something that recognized what it was seeing without needing to be part of it. Their eyes met across the garage. He raised one hand briefly, a gesture that was not a wave and not a salute, just an acknowledgement. She walked toward him. The celebrations in the garage had the organized chaos of a moment everyone had planned for without quite believing would happen. There was champagne that appeared from somewhere. Someone had been hiding it since the morning, optimistically. There were phones everywhere, photos being taken, people calling people who needed to be called. Elliot Graves had descended from the VIP suite and was shaking hands with engineers he'd never met, generating the particular energy of a man who wants to be proximate to victory. Vanessa moved through all of it to the back corner where Mason had been standing. He was sitting on an equipment case, looking at his phone. "My daughter sent me a drawing," he said, before she could speak. He turned the screen toward her. It was a crayon drawing, a stick figure man working on a car, somewhat aggressively colored in orange and blue. "She does this when she knows I'm working. She sends me drawings of what she imagines I'm doing." Vanessa looked at the drawing. It was not technically sophisticated. It was extremely accurate in the emotional sense. "That's quite good," she said. "She's 8. She doesn't know what she drew." Vanessa sat down on a nearby equipment cart. Around them, the celebration continued. Loud, genuine, slightly overwhelming. Here, in this corner, it was quieter. "I need to ask you something," she said. "I figured you would." "Who are you, actually?" Mason looked at his phone for a moment, then put it in his pocket. He looked at the floor, then at her. He had the expression of a man who has had a version of this conversation before and has had time to develop an honest answer that is also somehow incomplete. "My name is Mason Reed," he said. "I run a repair shop on Rue de la Condamine. I have for about 6 years. Before that, I worked in formula racing. Electrical systems engineering, I was with 3 different teams over 8 years." "Which teams?" He told her. She recognized 2 of them immediately. The third she knew by reputation. A midfield team from a decade ago that had produced, in its brief competitive window, some genuinely innovative engineering work before a financial collapse had ended it. "You were at Cavalier when they had the hybrid controversy," she said slowly. It wasn't a question. "I was on the team, yes." The Cavalier controversy had happened 9 years ago. It had involved allegations of illegal energy recovery systems. Allegations that had ultimately been investigated, found to be based on a misinterpretation of the regulations, and formally resolved with no penalty. But the process had been ugly. Several engineers had left the sport during it, some by choice, some less so. "Did you leave because of that?" she asked. "Partly." He was quiet for a moment. "My wife died that year, during the investigation. Ovarian cancer. She was diagnosed in January and she was gone by July. I had a 2-year-old. He said it in the way people say things that have been said enough times to become facts rather than wounds, even though the wound is still there underneath. The investigation gave me the professional reason to stop. My daughter gave me the real one." Vanessa was quiet. "I don't regret it," he said. "In case that's your next question." It wasn't, actually. She looked at him. "My next question was going to be about the grounding lug." That surprised him. A small thing, a slight shift in his expression, a fraction of amusement appearing around the eyes. "What about it?" "You said the diagnosis was a power path issue, not a component failure, based on clean diagnostics but failed startup. How certain were you of that before you looked under the car?" "About 70%. "And the other 30? "The other 30% thought maybe it was a firmware issue in the hybrid control unit, but that felt less consistent with the fuel rig story." He tilted his head slightly. "Why?" "Because it seems like a significant inference from incomplete information. Most diagnoses are." He shifted on the equipment case. "The diagnostic systems in these cars are designed to catch known failure modes. They're very good at it, but they have a structural blind spot, which is that they can't report on conditions they're not programmed to recognize. A displaced grounding lug that doesn't fully break circuit continuity isn't in the failure catalog. The system doesn't know to look for it. So the system reports nominal, because from the system's perspective, it is nominal. The fault is in the physical world, not in the data. Vanessa processed this. So the more sophisticated the diagnostic system, the harder it becomes to see the simple things it's not designed to see, Mason finished. Yeah. She looked at him for a long moment. I'd like to offer you a position, she said. He didn't look surprised. He looked like a man who had been waiting to hear this and had his answer ready. I appreciate that, he said, and I'm going to say no. Before you finish saying no, my answer is no. Not hard, not cold, just final. I have a repair shop, I have a daughter who gets out of school at 3:30, I have a life I built deliberately, and I'm not interested in rebuilding it again. The position wouldn't require Vanessa. He said her name for the first time, and something about the directness of it made her stop. I've heard this conversation before. It doesn't end with the position wouldn't require. I've worked in this world. I know how it works. It requires everything. That's not a criticism of you or your organization. It's just how this sport operates, and that's not what I want. She looked at him. He looked back at her. Okay, she said. He seemed slightly surprised that she'd accepted it that quickly. Okay, he said. I disagree with your assessment of what the position would require, and I think you're making a decision based on your experience with an industry that has changed in the time you've been away from it. But it's your decision. She paused. Is there anything you would consider? He thought about it, genuinely thought about it. She could see him actually weighing something rather than performing consideration. Occasionally, he said, if there was a problem I could help with, without a title or a schedule or a structure around it, if someone needed a different question asked. That's an unusual offer. I'm an unusual situation. A beat. I also occasionally work with young engineers, students, apprentices, people who are starting out. I talk to them about how to think about problems. Not the technical content. They get that elsewhere. But how to ask questions. How to follow a sequence rather than jump to a theory. Vanessa thought about the career she had spent building this team, the years of recruiting and developing talent, the early engineers who had become senior engineers who had become department heads. She thought about what it might mean to have someone teach young engineers how to ask a different kind of question. I'll find a way to make that useful, she said. He nodded. The celebration behind them had reached a comfortable volume, still ongoing, but past the manic peak of the first 20 minutes. Someone was going to want Vanessa for a video call with the sponsors in about 15 minutes. Marco would find her. Your daughter, she said. What's her name? Lily. How much does she know about what you did before? She knows I used to work with race cars. She thinks it was a long time ago. A small pause. It was a long time ago. And today? Does she know where you were? I told her I had to go help someone with their car. The corner of his mouth moved, the closest he'd come to a full smile in the time she'd known him. Which is accurate. Vanessa stood. She put out her hand. He stood and shook it, firm, brief, the handshake of two people who have come to a mutual understanding of something and don't need to say what it is. Thank you, Mason Reed. Get your driver to the podium, he said. He's waiting. She turned and walked back into the celebration. When she glanced back from the other side of the garage, he was gone. Mason Reed walked out of the Blackwood garage, through the Paddock service road, through the public access gate where a volunteer checked his temporary visitor credential without interest, and out into the city of Monaco, which was, as always, doing its best to accommodate several different realities simultaneously. The racing world and the civilian world and the tourist world and the world of people who simply lived here and had opinions about the traffic on race day. He'd parked his truck on a side street 8 minutes from the circuit. He walked the 8 minutes at the pace of someone who has nowhere urgent to be and knows it. The truck was a 9-year-old Peugeot Partner in a shade of gray that had faded to something between concrete and sky. The cab smelled like motor oil and the particular synthetic scent of the seat covers Lily had picked out at a market 2 summers ago, bright blue with small yellow stars, emphatically not the gray ones that had been there before. He got in. He sat for a moment. He didn't feel triumphant. He'd solved a problem, which was what he did when problems appeared in front of him. He'd also met someone who had looked at him the way people in this industry sometimes looked at him, with a particular kind of attention that was recognition plus calculation, the look of someone adding up what they're seeing and arriving at a number they want to use. He'd been looked at like that before. It had, in the past, led to things he'd wanted, big things, significant things, things that had mattered and that he still, honestly, in quiet moments, thought about with something that wasn't quite regret, but wasn't quite not regret either. He thought about the grounding lug. There was a version of the story where Mason Reed found the grounding lug, and no one remembered who he was, and a version where they found out, and it changed things. He'd engineered the second version into the first by the simple fact of declining the offer, which was the thing he'd always done, in the years since Lily was born, when the industry tried to bring him back in. He declined. He went home. He was there at 3:30. He started the truck. The radio came on, local station, already covering the race result. The announcement of the winner, the championship standing, the last lap drama. He drove. The school was a 10-minute drive from the circuit, 15 with post-race traffic. Mason arrived at 3:28 p.m. and parked in the parent pickup area, which was already filling with the specific combination of minivans, compact sedans, and carefully maintained older cars that characterized the school pickup lane at the International Primary School on Avenue Sainte-Marie. He was 2 minutes early. This was intentional. He had never, in 6 years of school pickups, been late. He'd been late to meetings, late to supplier deliveries, late to phone calls with people who probably deserved his punctuality more than they got. He had never been late to this. At 3:31, the main doors opened and children emerged in the particular torrent that school releases always produced. An explosion of small people with large backpacks who somehow managed to locate their specific parent or caregiver in the crowd with the efficiency of biological homing devices. Lily found him in about 4 seconds. She was small for 8. She had been small for 7 and 6 and 5 before that, and the pediatrician said she'd likely catch up, and Mason had developed a philosophical position on the subject, which was that it didn't matter. And she had her mother's dark hair and her father's tendency to have both hands occupied with something at all times. Today, it was a plastic folder and a lunch bag, and what appeared to be a papier-mâché creature of some kind, origin unclear. She arrived at his side at something between a walk and a controlled fall. "Dad? Hey, Bug. I made a hedgehog." She held up the papier-mâché creature, which was, now that he saw it up close, recognizably hedgehog-shaped, if you extended the definition generously. "It's for the science fair table? That's a great hedgehog. It's not done. I still have to paint the spines." She assessed him with the particular evaluative look she'd developed somewhere around age 6, a look that scanned for information about his day with the efficiency of a device running a diagnostic. "Your shirt has something on it." He looked down. The concrete smear from the garage floor. He'd forgotten about it. "Yeah. What were you fixing?" He thought about car number 7, about a grounding lug behind a wishbone bracket, about 91 engineers and one question. "A car," he said. "Was it hard?" "Not really." He took the papier-mâché hedgehog from her so she could manage her backpack. "How was school?" "Good. Mathieu said hedgehogs don't hibernate in Monaco, but I looked it up and they do. Well, some of them." She fell into step beside him. "We heard a race car during lunch. Everyone said it was the Grand Prix." "It was." "Did you hear it?" "I was pretty close to it, actually." She looked up at him. "How close?" He considered the question honestly. "Close enough to hear the engine start." She seemed to find this satisfactory. She accepted the hedgehog back as they reached the truck, tucking it carefully under her arm while she climbed in. Mason started the engine. "Dad?" Lily said, settling the hedgehog on her lap with care. "Yeah. I sent you a drawing." "I saw it. It was good." "It was you fixing the car." She looked at the hedgehog, then out the window at the pickup lane traffic. "I drew it small because I didn't know how big the car was." "The car," Mason said, pulling out of the parking space, "is actually quite large." "Bigger than our car." "Much bigger." She considered this. "I'll draw a bigger one next time." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to. I want to." She looked out the window at the buildings going past. Did the car you fixed win? He thought about Kai Nakamura crossing a finish line, about Vanessa Blackwood on a pit wall, about a garage where people were right now opening champagne and calling family members and beginning the process of assembling this day into a memory they'd carry for a long time. Yeah, he said. It won. Good, Lily said. And she appeared to feel that the subject was settled, because she went back to looking at her hedgehog with the focused attention of an 8-year-old who has a project and knows what it needs. They drove home through the post-race traffic, which was heavy and slow and didn't bother either of them particularly. The radio, still on the local station, was describing the championship as a historic moment, a triumph of engineering and strategy and human will, the culmination of 4 years of work by an organization that had refused to stop believing. Mason turned it down. Not off, just down, just quiet enough that you had to pay attention to hear it. The celebration at Blackwood Motorsport's Monaco base lasted until nearly midnight. Vanessa knew this because Marco sent her updates on it. The team dinner that started at 7 and became something louder and less structured by 9. The engineers, who had been awake for 36 hours, finally allowing themselves to decompress in the specific way that people decompress when the thing they've been holding together finally holds on its own. She got a photo from Chen at 10:47 p.m. of Priya asleep in a chair in the corner of the restaurant with a glass of wine still in her hand, which Vanessa saved to her phone without fully understanding why. She herself had not made the dinner. There were obligations after a championship win that most people didn't see. The sponsor calls, the FIA documentation, the press obligations, the logistics of getting the team and equipment back from Monaco without the adrenaline that had carried them through the past 48 hours. She'd done all of it in the 3 hours following the podium ceremony, sitting in the hospitality unit with Diane Okafor on one side and the team's commercial director on the other, managing the public face of a victory that felt, from the inside, significantly more complicated than it looked from the outside. Elliot Graves had found her during the podium champagne and shaken her hand and said, "Extraordinary work, Vanessa, as always." He'd said it the way people say things they mean as compliments that land slightly differently than intended, as always suggesting that this was expected, that anything less would have been the anomaly. She'd smiled and thanked him and moved on, because that was what you did, and because she understood that men like Elliot Graves genuinely didn't hear what they were saying when they said things like that, and it wasn't worth the energy of explaining it. By the time she got back to her hotel room, it was past 11. She sat on the edge of the bed with her shoes still on and her jacket over the back of the chair and her phone in her hand, and she thought about Mason Reed. She'd had Marco get his contact information, a phone number, a business address on Rue de la Condamine, nothing else. No social media presence that anyone could find. No professional profile. He existed in the digital record of professional motorsport only in the way that people exist who left before social media made leaving harder. A few archived team rosters, a technical paper published in a motorsport engineering journal 11 years ago under the name M. Reed, and 2 co-authors, a single photograph from a team photo that Marco had found through a motorsport archive site, in which a younger version of Mason stood in the back row with the slightly uncomfortable posture of someone who knew the photo was being taken and had not adjusted to its being taken. Vanessa looked at the technical paper for a long time. It was titled, "Ground Path Integrity in High-Frequency Hybrid Switching Systems, a Framework for Diagnostic Blind Spots." It had been published in the International Journal of Motorsport Engineering 9 years ago, 6 months before his wife died, 2 years before he left the sport. The abstract described, in precise technical language, exactly the category of failure he had identified in her garage that afternoon. The class of electrical faults that exist below the threshold of standard diagnostic detection because they are intermittent and load-dependent rather than static and measurable. He had published a paper about the exact thing he came and fixed. Vanessa read the abstract 3 times. Then she put her phone face down on the nightstand and looked at the ceiling for a while. She thought about the kind of mind that produces something like that. Not just the technical knowledge, which was significant, but the framework. The idea that the sophistication of your diagnostic system creates its own category of invisible problem. That the better your instruments, the more completely you trust them, and the more thoroughly you stopped looking at the things the instruments weren't built to see. She thought about her team. 91 of them, most of them brilliant, all of them looking at screens. She thought about a man on the floor of the garage with a flashlight. She was not by nature a person who lost sleep over things she couldn't immediately act on. She'd developed this capacity early. Her father had been a man of acute anxieties who'd passed on to her the lesson, through negative example, of what it costs to carry everything you couldn't control. She slept reasonably well most nights. She'd learned to close the tab. Tonight she lay awake for a while. Not with anxiety exactly, more with the feeling of a question she hadn't finished asking. 3 weeks after the Monaco Grand Prix, Vanessa Blackwood flew back to Monaco. This was not unusual in itself. She maintained a small office in the Principality for operational reasons, and the off-season brought its own administrative density, the period when contracts were renegotiated and development programs were scoped, and the team structure for the following year was assembled from the pieces of the one just completed. She was there for 4 days of meetings, the kind that involved whiteboards and catering trays, and the specific stale quality of air in rooms where important things are being decided at medium speed. On the third morning, she had a gap in her schedule between 9 and 11. She drove herself to Rue de la Condamine. The repair shop was a single-bay unit on the ground floor of a building that had probably been built in the 1960s and had been maintained since with the philosophy of fixing what broke and leaving what didn't. The bay door was open. Inside, a gray Citroen was elevated on a 2-post lift, and Mason Reed was standing beneath it with a grease-covered hand wrapped around something in the suspension area, frowning at it the way he'd frowned at the underside of car number 7. That same focused, unhurried attention. He didn't hear her pull up, or he did and didn't react. She wasn't sure which. She got out of her rental car. A modest thing, because she didn't perform wealth in contexts where it was beside the point, and walked to the bay entrance. She stood there for a moment. "I'm not here to offer you the job again," she said. Mason looked over his shoulder. Whatever he'd been expecting, which was probably a customer, he adjusted to the reality of Vanessa Blackwood without visible disruption. He straightened, wiped his hand on a rag that was already well past its useful life, and turned around. "Okay," he said. "I'm here because I read your paper." He was quiet for a moment. Something moved across his face. Not discomfort exactly. The particular expression of a person encountering something they'd thought they'd filed away. "Which paper?" "The one on ground path integrity and diagnostic blind spots." She paused. "Published 9 years ago." He nodded slowly. "You found that." "Marco found it. I read it." She tilted her head. "You described the exact failure mode you fixed in my garage. You published a paper about it 9 years ago." "I did." "And you've been running a repair shop for 6 years." "Also true." "Does that—" She stopped, reshaped the question. "Does it not frustrate you, having that kind of knowledge and applying it to—" She gestured at the Citroen on the lift. "Civilian suspension work?" Mason looked at the Citroen, then back at her. "That car belongs to a 73-year-old woman named Hélène Marchetti. She drives it to see her sister and niece twice a month. The suspension's been deteriorating for about a year. She didn't notice because it happened gradually, and she brought it in because someone at her building told her it sounded wrong. If I don't fix it properly, she might have a handling failure on the auto route." He paused. "I don't think the work is beneath the knowledge. I think that's the wrong way to look at it." Vanessa looked at him for a moment. "Fair point," she said, which was not what she'd intended to say. He set the rag down on his workbench. "You want coffee? I've got a machine in the back. It's not good coffee." "Sure." The back of the shop was a narrow space with a workbench, a filing cabinet, a small table with 2 metal chairs, and a coffee machine that appeared to have been purchased sometime in the early 2000s and kept alive through a combination of maintenance and stubbornness. On one wall there was a shelf with technical manuals, some factory service manuals for common European models, some older automotive engineering texts, and she noticed, on the end, a row of motorsport engineering journals dating back about 15 years, their spines marked with colored tape at specific pages. On the table was a child's drawing, a car, bigger this time, in orange and blue crayon. more detailed than the one on his phone screen 3 weeks ago. She could see wheels, a vague approximation of a cockpit, what might have been a number on the side. She updated it, he said, handing her a cup of coffee. He glanced at the drawing. After I told her the car was bigger than she'd drawn, Vanessa picked it up carefully. The number on the side was recognizable, a 7, thick and slightly crooked. She drew car number 7, Vanessa said. She asked what number it was. Vanessa set the drawing back down with care. She drank the coffee, which was exactly as not good as advertised. Tell me about the paper, she said. Mason sat down in one of the metal chairs. He didn't look reluctant exactly, but more like someone deciding how much of a landscape to describe when asked a question about it. I wrote it during my second year at Cavalier. We'd had an intermittent startup fault on the car that took us 3 races to diagnose. Every time we tried to reproduce it in the controlled environment, we couldn't. The diagnostic systems showed nothing. We eventually traced it to a grounding issue in the hybrid motor control circuit, a connection that was stable at low power loads but degraded under the spike of the startup sequence. The same failure mode. A cousin of it. He drank his own coffee. After we solved it, I spent about 6 weeks writing up the framework, not just the specific fix, the general principle. The idea that when you build a diagnostic system, you're also building the map of what the system knows how to find. And anything outside that map is, by definition, invisible to it. You don't just solve problems with better instruments. Sometimes you solve them by stepping away from the instruments and asking what they were built to miss. Vanessa held her cup in both hands. Outside, a delivery truck moved slowly past the bay entrance, its engine loud and diesel heavy. Monaco traffic. Did anyone at Cavalier act on the framework after the paper was published? Some people read it. I got a few responses from people at other teams, academics, a couple of engineers. But it's not the kind of thing the industry moves fast to implement, because the industry is optimizing for speed and data density. And what I was describing was essentially an argument for slowing down and looking at the floor. A beat. Nobody moves to the front of the grid by slowing down. Except in this case. Except in this case. A silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable. The kind of silence that happens when 2 intelligent people have arrived at the same point from different directions and are deciding whether to keep walking. Why did you come today? Mason asked. Really? Vanessa considered being evasive. She rejected it. Because I think there's something wrong with how my team thinks about problems, and I think you understood something in about 10 minutes that my senior engineers hadn't understood in 2 hours. And I want to know if that's something that can be taught. She set down her cup. Not because I want to recruit you, because I think you're right that the best diagnostics can create the worst blind spots, and I run an organization of 300 people who are all looking at screens. Mason was quiet for a moment. What do you want me to say? I want your honest opinion on whether it's a teachable thing, the way you think about problems. He looked at the shelf of journals. He looked at the drawing on the table. He took a long breath through his nose and let it out slowly, the way people do when they're not performing reluctance but are genuinely working something through. It's teachable, he said, but it's not a curriculum. You can't put it in a training module and have people do it online and tick a box. It's more like... He stopped. Tried again. It's a habit of the mind. You have to practice asking what the system was built to miss before you trust the system. You have to practice narrating the sequence before you theorize about the cause. You have to get comfortable with the feeling of not knowing and staying in that feeling long enough to actually look, instead of jumping to the most sophisticated available explanation. He paused. Most highly trained people hate that feeling. They've spent years developing sophisticated explanations. The sophisticated explanation is what their career is built on. So you have to unlearn expertise. Not unlearn. Hold it looser. He glanced at her. There's a difference. You don't throw away the knowledge. You just stop letting it tell you what to look for before you've looked. Vanessa thought about Chen, on his knees next to the car, telling her they'd been through everything, the specific exhaustion of a man who had run out of sophisticated explanations. She thought about Priya, brilliant, thorough, precise, who had looked at the same area Mason had focused on and had not seen what he'd seen. Not because they weren't smart enough, because they were looking for something their training had taught them to recognize. Would you be willing to come talk to some of my engineers? She said. Not a formal session, not a workshop with a title and a certification, just a conversation about how you think, with people who think differently. Mason looked at the drawing on the table for a long moment. When? He said. It took another 2 weeks to arrange. The logistics were deliberately simple. Vanessa had learned from 30 years of managing organizations that the more structure you put around an unconventional thing, the more it resembled a conventional thing and stopped working. She didn't put Mason's name on an agenda. She didn't circulate a bio or a summary of what happened in Monaco. Most of the engineers knew the story already, in the way that things that happen in garages become known throughout organizations within hours. But she didn't want the conversation to be about the story. She wanted it to be about the thinking. She chose a Thursday afternoon in late November, in the team's technical facility outside London, a building she'd had designed 8 years ago with the philosophy that people do better work in spaces that have actual natural light and somewhere comfortable to sit that isn't a conference room. There was a room on the 3rd floor that was used for informal reviews and design critiques, with a long table, windows on 2 sides, and a coffee setup that was significantly better than the machine in Mason's shop. She invited 6 people: Chen, Priya, Julio Martinez, a young aerodynamics engineer named Simone Faure, who had joined the team 6 months ago and whom Vanessa had already identified as someone worth watching, a data systems engineer named Rohan Kapoor, and the team's chief strategist, Elena Voss. She told them only that someone was coming to talk about diagnostic thinking, and that she expected them to treat it as a working conversation rather than a presentation. Mason arrived 12 minutes late, which she later learned was because he dropped Lily at school and misjudged the train schedule. He came in without apology, looked at the room, said, "Sorry, train," and sat down. He had the same work clothes he'd been wearing in Monaco, or a version of them: dark pants, a Henley, boots. He had brought nothing with him: no laptop, no slides, no materials. He sat at the table the way a person sits who is comfortable occupying space without filling it with anything. Chen looked at Vanessa. She looked back at him. "I thought you might start," she said to Mason, "by talking about how you actually diagnosed the fault in Monaco, not the technical content, the process." "Sure." He looked around the table. He didn't seem nervous exactly, but he also didn't seem like someone who gave talks regularly. "How much do you all know about what happened?" "We were there," Priya said. Her voice was not hostile, but it was precise. She was a person who said things exactly and meant them. "Or most of us were. I was under the car when you found it." "Right," he nodded. "Then you know I spent the first few minutes asking questions rather than looking at anything. What did that seem like to you when it was happening?" Priya was quiet for a moment. "Unusual," she said. "We'd been through the technical systems comprehensively. The data showed nothing we hadn't already investigated." "What were the questions I was asking?" "You asked about the sequence. What happened between the last successful run and the failure? And what was the team's framework before I arrived? What was the organizing theory?" Chen answered this one. "We were treating it as a component failure or a software fault, something within the car's documented failure catalog." Which meant we were looking for things the diagnostic system was designed to detect. Chen said it with the flatness of a man who has had 3 weeks to sit with this realization. "We were searching within the map." "Right." Mason put both hands on the table. They were mechanic's hands. There was no other word for it. The kind of hands that have spent enough time on physical problems that the evidence shows in the skin and the joints. The car's systems were telling you everything was nominal. You believed them because the systems are very good. But the systems were built to detect a specific category of failure, and what happened to the car was outside that category. The systems weren't wrong, they were just limited. And the limitation was invisible because the systems themselves can't tell you what they can't see. "So how did you know to look outside the catalog?" Simone Faure asked. She was 26, French, with the direct quality of someone who'd learned that asking the obvious question was almost always worth it. "Because it seems like the reasonable assumption, when the diagnostics show nothing, is that the fault is very subtle within the known categories, not that it's in a category the diagnostics can't detect." That's exactly the reasonable assumption, Mason said. And it's usually right. Most faults are in the catalog. The diagnostics find them. He paused. But there's a tell. When a fault is in the catalog, the system will eventually show something, even intermittently, even as a partial signal. If you run enough tests, you'll get a ghost of it. What you had that morning was a car that showed absolutely nothing through multiple diagnostic cycles, while also failing completely and repeatedly. That combination, clean data plus consistent failure, points away from catalog faults and towards something the system genuinely cannot see. The room was quiet in the way rooms go quiet when people are thinking rather than waiting for something. Rohan Kapoor, who was the youngest person in the room and had been silent for the first 15 minutes, leaned forward. "That's actually a signal," he said slowly. "Clean diagnostics plus consistent failure is itself diagnostic. It tells you something about the category of fault." "Yeah." Mason looked at him. "What's your background?" "Data systems. I built part of the telemetry architecture." "Then you already understand this. Your system is doing exactly what it was designed to do. The output you were getting, clean data, consistent failure, was accurate. The interpretation was wrong because the interpretation framework assumed the diagnostic system was comprehensive." He spread his hand slightly. "No system is comprehensive. Every system has a boundary. The useful habit is to learn where your system's boundary is and start asking questions there, not in the middle where the system's confident." Elena Voss, the chief strategist, had been making notes. She looked up. "This applies outside engineering," she said. It was an observation, not a question. "It applies to anything where you're using instruments to understand a complex reality," Mason said. "The instrument is always a model of reality, not reality itself. When the model and the reality stop agreeing, you have to decide whether the reality is wrong or the model is limited." A beat. "Reality is never wrong." The conversation went on for an hour and 40 minutes. It was not a lecture. Mason was not built for lecturing. He didn't enjoy performing knowledge, which was actually one of the things that made him effective in a room. He asked as many questions as he answered, and the questions were the kind that forced the engineers to articulate things they knew but hadn't said, which is a different cognitive exercise than receiving information and significantly more useful. At one point, he and Rohan got into a detailed technical exchange about the architecture of the telemetry system that Vanessa didn't fully follow, but that ended with Rohan staring at the table for about 30 seconds and then saying, quietly, "I need to redesign the alert hierarchy." At another point, Simone described an aerodynamic anomaly they'd seen earlier in the season, a drag increase in specific corner sequences that the CFD modeling hadn't predicted. And Mason walked her through a diagnostic sequence that started not with the model, but with the physical sequence of what the car had done before the anomaly appeared. And by the time they finished, Simone had 3 specific things she wanted to go back and look at in the wind tunnel data. Chen was largely quiet for the second half. He asked one question near the end. "In your years in the sport, how often did you encounter a fault in this category, the invisible to diagnostic type?" 4 times, Mason said, not counting Monaco. "And in how many years?" 8. So roughly once every 2 years. About that. "And in each case, how long did it take the team to diagnose it through standard methods?" Mason thought about it. "The shortest was 3 weeks. The longest, at my first team before I knew what to look for, was most of a season." Chen looked at Vanessa. She didn't look back. She was watching Mason. "Most of a season," Chen repeated. "The car was losing maybe a quarter of a second a lap in a specific condition. Not consistent enough to pin down." The team tried 17 different technical hypotheses over 8 months. The actual cause was a grounding path degradation in the energy recovery system, intermittent, load-dependent, invisible to the diagnostic suite they had at the time. How did they finally find it? A new engineer joined the team in August. He asked what happened the week before the fault first appeared. Mason looked at the table. Nobody had asked that before. 8 months of technical investigation, nobody had asked the sequence. The room was quiet. The answer was that a minor suspension component had been replaced as a precaution after a barrier contact, Mason continued. The installation had displaced a grounding clip by a few millimeters. Same category as Monaco. Different location, different system, different car, same basic fault. You published the paper after that. After a later experience at Cavalier that confirmed the pattern, yes. I thought if it was in print somewhere, people would start building it into their diagnostic frameworks. He paused. Apparently the take-up was limited. The industry moves fast, Chen said. Not defensively, just factually. The industry moves fast, Mason agreed. Awesome. Vanessa drove him to the train station afterward. It wasn't necessary. There was a car service available. But she'd offered and he'd accepted without the performance of declining that some people would have managed. He sat in the passenger seat of her car with the same quality of presence he'd had since Monaco. Not filling the silence, not producing conversation for its own sake. Thank you, she said. That was genuinely useful. Rohan's going to fix something meaningful, he said. The alert hierarchy thing. He's already thinking about it. I noticed. And Simone's going to find whatever's wrong with her drag model. She had the answer before I asked the question. She just needed to follow the sequence instead of the theory. Vanessa glanced at him. You see it fast, what people are close to. I've been in enough rooms. He watched the London suburbs move past the window. It was grey and cold in the particular way that late November is grey and cold in England, which is a different quality of grey and cold than Monaco, but equally specific. In engineering, people usually already have the answer. They just need someone to ask them a different question. Is that why you stay in the repair shop? Because you get to ask the question without inheriting all the structure that makes the question impossible? He thought about it. Partially. He looked at a roundabout going past. Also because the repair shop is where I am. I built it. My daughter knows it. It's familiar in the way that familiar things are actually important, not just comfortable. A pause. I think we undervalue familiarity. We treat it like it's the enemy of ambition. But ambition doesn't keep you warm. That sounds like something you've said before. It's something I thought about for about 3 years after leaving the sport, so probably it's been through several drafts. The station appeared ahead. A medium-sized commuter station, nothing distinguished about it. Vanessa pulled up to the curb. The heater in the car was running, and outside it was visibly cold, the kind of cold that makes the air visible. I want to do this again, she said. Not constantly. Twice a year, maybe. Different people in the room. He looked at her. The same terms. No title, no schedule, a conversation. Then yes. He opened the door. The cold came in immediately, the way it does. Tell Chen to stop blaming himself for Monaco. He ran the diagnostics correctly. The diagnostics just had a blind spot. He knows. Knowing doesn't always help with blame. He got out, bent back slightly to look at her through the open door. How's the car running, by the way? Perfectly. Postseason maintenance found nothing unusual. Good. He straightened. Tell Kai he drove the last 17 laps about as well as it can be driven. I'll tell him you said so. Mason closed the door. He walked toward the station entrance without looking back, his hands in his pockets, his boots making the particular sound boots make, on the kind of pavement that British train stations favor. He was a big man, but he moved through the crowd without displacing it, in the way of people who have learned to occupy exactly the space they're in and no more. Vanessa watched him go until the station doors closed behind him. Then she sat in the car for a moment, engine running, heater running, the London cold outside. She thought about a paper published 9 years ago, about a man who had written the framework for finding invisible faults and then stepped away from the industry that needed the framework to raise a daughter who drew orange and blue race cars in crayon with a 7 on the side. She thought about something he'd said early in the Monaco garage that she hadn't registered fully at the time. I followed the sequence. The rest was just looking. She pulled out of the station and drove back toward the city. On the radio, someone was discussing the off-season driver market, the names and numbers and probabilities of a sport that never fully stopped. She listened to it the way you listen to a language you speak but haven't spoken in a while, understanding everything, aware of the distance. She called Diane Okafor that evening from her hotel room. Diane was the team's PR director and a woman Vanessa trusted with the unpolished version of things. "I need to ask you something operational," Vanessa said. "Go ahead." "If I wanted to bring in an external consultant, not formally, not on retainer, not with a contract, someone who talks to our people twice a year about how to think, how would you recommend we handle it internally without it becoming a thing?" Diane was quiet for a second. "Who is the person?" "Mason Reed." "The mechanic from Monaco." "He's not—" Vanessa stopped. "He's a former professional engineer who now runs a repair shop." "Yes." "Vanessa, the story of what he did in Monaco has been internal team gossip for 3 weeks. 3 separate engineers have asked me independently whether we're going to hire him." "I know." "So bringing him in twice a year as an unofficial consultant is going to generate a certain amount of attention." "I know." "And he doesn't want the attention." "I know." Diane was quiet again. When she spoke, it was with the careful tone of someone choosing words precisely. "Then I'd suggest we don't call it consulting. We don't list him anywhere. He comes in, he talks to people, he leaves. No badge, no meeting notes, no HR file. Informally, on a handshake. That's probably what he'd want. It's also probably the only way it works. The moment you put a structure around him, he stops being the thing he is." A pause. "What is he exactly? Do you know yet?" Vanessa thought about a man on his back on a garage floor with a flashlight, about a paper published 9 years ago that nobody implemented, about a metal chair in a repair shop and coffee that wasn't good, and a crayon drawing on a table. "I think he's the person who asks what happened," she said, "in rooms full of people asking what's wrong." "Is that different?" "Completely." Diane digested this. "Okay," she said, "I'll figure out the internal handling. You just make sure he keeps showing up." "He'll show up," Vanessa said. "He does what he says he'll do." She knew this with the particular certainty of having observed it once, in a 23-minute window, under significant pressure. Some people you needed a long time to understand. Others, you only needed to see them once in a crisis. Outside her hotel window, London was doing what London did at night in November, absorbing the dark slowly, the streetlights and the headlights, and the lit windows of 100,000 lives arranged in no particular pattern. She thought about Lily Reed, 8 years old, asleep right now probably, in whatever bedroom belonged to her in the apartment above the repair shop on Rue de la Condamine, surrounded by drawings and a papier-mâché hedgehog and the ordinary furniture of a life that had been deliberately and carefully chosen. She thought about what it cost to choose something deliberately, to know what the alternatives were worth and still choose the smaller thing, the quieter thing, the thing that didn't get photographed. She turned off the lamp. She stared at the ceiling. The heater in the room made a small sound. Outside, the city made its low, continuous sound. She slept. In Monaco, Mason Reed came home to Rue de la Condamine at 7:45, which was later than usual, later than he liked. He could hear from the bottom of the stairs that Lily was still awake, the specific sound of a child who has been told to be in bed and has interpreted this instruction creatively. He went up the stairs. He knocked on her door. He opened it. She was in bed, which was technically compliance, and she had a book open, which was the creative interpretation. She looked at him with the expression of someone who knows they're caught and has decided confidence is the better strategy. "I was reading," she said. "I can see that. What time is it?" "Past 7:30. She considered this. "I finished my homework." "I know," Mrs. Petrova texted. He sat on the edge of her bed. She shifted to make room with the automatic ease of a child who has been sharing this geography with one parent for her entire remembered life. "How is the hedgehog today?" "I painted 3 spines. I'm doing 5 at a time so they dry evenly." She looked at her book, then at him. "How was your meeting?" "Good." "Did you talk to the engineer people?" "Yeah." "Were they smart?" He thought about Chen's expression when he understood the blind spot, about Simone Faure leaning forward to ask the obvious question that turned out to be the important question, about Rohan Kapoor saying, "I need to redesign the alert hierarchy," and meaning it, the particular look of someone who has just seen something they can fix. Very, he said. She nodded like this was satisfying information. Did you teach them something? I asked them some questions. Maybe that helped. She appeared to find this answer philosophically acceptable. She looked at her book again. It was a story about a girl who could talk to animals, which she had been reading for 2 weeks with the focused attention she brought to things she genuinely liked. She turned a page. Dad? Yeah. You know how I drew the car bigger after you told me it was big? Yeah. If the car wins again next year, should I draw a trophy? She looked up. Or is that showing off? He looked at her. 8 years old. Her mother's eyes, his father's stubbornness, her own specific quality of attention that belonged entirely to her. It's not showing off, he said. You can draw whatever you want. Okay? She went back to her book. I'll add a trophy then. He sat there for a moment longer than he needed to. The room was small and warm, and the lamp on her nightstand made everything the color of late afternoon. Outside, Monaco at night made its specific sounds: water, traffic, the distant echo of the harbor. He got up. He straightened her blanket without being asked, which she tolerated without comment, which was its own form of affection. 10 more minutes, he said, then light out. 15. 10. Fine. She turned a page. 10. He went to the kitchen. He made himself a bowl of something minimal and ate it standing over the counter, looking at nothing in particular. He thought about the conversation in London, about the engineers and what they were close to and what they couldn't see yet. He thought about Vanessa Blackwood sitting across from him in a repair shop, asking whether the thinking was teachable. He thought it probably was. He washed the bowl. He dried it. He put it back in the cabinet where it went. In Lily's room, the lamp went out at almost exactly 10 minutes. He heard the click of it from the kitchen. He stood there in this quiet of his apartment, in the city he'd chosen, in the life he'd built around the one thing that mattered most, and he felt, not happiness exactly, because happiness was too simple a word for something this complicated, but something that had weight to it, the specific gravity of a thing that is real because you made it real on purpose. He went to bed. The second session happened in February, 4 months after the first. Vanessa had initially planned it for January, but January had swallowed itself whole. The off-season in professional motorsport was a fiction, a word that existed on calendars without existing in reality. The new chassis was in development. The engine supplier had changed a specification that required 3 weeks of integration work. Kai Nakamura's contract renewal had gone to the wire in a negotiation that produced, on both sides, the specific exhaustion of people who respect each other but disagree about money. By the time January ended, Vanessa had slept an average of 5.5 hours a night and had eaten approximately 40% of her meals at her desk, which she knew and had chosen not to examine too closely. February arrived and she made the call. Same room, different people. She rotated deliberately the way you rotate things that work, to spread them rather than concentrate them. This time she invited 4 engineers from the chassis development group, the team's test driver, a simulation specialist named Tobias Weir, who was 23 and had joined from a gaming company and still carried the slightly dazed quality of someone who couldn't fully believe the job was real, and Elena Voss again, because Elena had said after the first session that she wanted to come back and Vanessa didn't refuse people who wanted more of something useful. Mason arrived on time this time. He had a travel coffee cup that said nothing on it. No logo, no team name, just a plain dark blue cylinder. And he sat down and looked around at the faces and said, "Different people. Good." "I try to spread useful things," Vanessa said. "Like a disease," he said, and the room laughed, which loosened something immediately. The conversation this time moved in a different direction. The first session had been about the diagnostic blind spot, about learning to see outside the instruments. This one drifted toward something adjacent but distinct, the problem of expertise as a filter. One of the chassis engineers, a man named Bertrand, who had been in the sport for 16 years and who wore his experience the way people wear coats that have been with them a long time, asked Mason a question that seemed simple and wasn't. "How do you know when your expertise is helping you and when it's getting in the way?" Mason held his coffee cup. He looked at the table for a moment. "Tell me about a time you were certain about something that turned out to be wrong," he said. Bertrand didn't hesitate, which surprised the room slightly. Silverstone 3 years ago. We had a floor efficiency drop that I was certain was an end plate issue. I'd seen it before, same symptom. Spent 2 weeks on the end plate. It was a floor seal delamination on the opposite side of the car. How did you finally find it? A junior engineer pointed it out. She'd been looking at the airflow visualization data from a slightly different angle, literally a different camera position in the CFD run. And she saw it. He paused. She'd been trying to tell me for 4 days. I kept explaining to her why it was the end plate. The room was quiet in a productive way. That's the answer to your question, Mason said. Your expertise was helping you with the technical analysis. It was getting in the way when you were evaluating someone else's uncertainty. You knew what the symptom meant because you'd seen it before. And that knowledge made it harder to hear someone say they weren't sure. Because certainty is contagious, Elena said. She was making notes again. In both directions. Certainty and uncertainty both move through a team the way temperature moves through a room. If the most senior person is certain, the juniors stop offering alternatives. If the most senior person says, "I'm not sure, tell me what you see," the juniors speak. He looked at Bertrand. How long had she been on the team? 4 months? And she could see something you couldn't. Because she didn't know it was the end plate, Bertrand said, with the flatness of someone who has fully absorbed a lesson that was uncomfortable to absorb. She had no reason to assume, she was just looking at the data. Fresh eyes solved this, Tobias said from the end of the table. He had the manner of someone from a different professional culture, less formal than the engineers, quicker to make connections across disciplines. In game development, we rotate QA testers specifically because the development team stops seeing their own bugs after a certain point. Familiarity blinds you to the obvious. Same principle, Mason said. Different industry, same human problem. So is the solution to always have a junior person in the room? The test driver, Alexandre Petitist. He was 31, Belgian, and had been in the sport long enough to be senior, but was still the kind of person who asked direct questions without worrying about how they landed. Because that seems impractical for real-time decisions. The solution isn't a person. The solution is a habit. You build into your process the practice of asking what you're assuming before you act on the assumption. Mason set down his coffee cup. In a garage situation, time pressure, high stakes, you do it fast. You spend 30 seconds saying out loud what you believe is true and why. Not to convince anyone, just to hear yourself say it. Because when you say a thing out loud, you hear the assumptions in it in a way you don't when it's just inside your head. 30 seconds, Alexandra said. Sometimes 20. It's not a formula, it's a reset. He looked around the table. The hardest thing about this for experienced people is that it feels like it's slowing you down. It feels like wasted time. But the time you spend resetting your assumptions at the beginning is almost always shorter than the time you spend correcting the wrong direction later. Simone Four wasn't in this session, but Mason asked about her, specifically whether she'd gone back to the drag data from the previous season. Elena said yes, 2 weeks ago, and she'd found a calibration error in one of the CFD boundary conditions that had introduced a systematic bias into 6 months of simulation data. They were still working out the implications, but the preliminary read was that the car had been set up slightly wrong for 4 races based on the skewed model, and the correction was informing the new chassis design. Mason nodded when he heard this. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, how much did that cost the team? In race results? Vanessa answered. Conservatively, we left about 8 points on the table across those 4 races, possibly 12. And the calibration error had been there the whole time. From the beginning of the simulation program, about 14 months. And Simone found it in how long? 2.5 weeks, once she started looking. Mason looked at the table, and he wasn't saying anything dramatic with his expression, just processing the way he processed things, without performance. 14 months, he said. 2.5 weeks. Yeah, Vanessa said. The cost of not asking the question is always higher than it looks, he said, because you don't see the cost. You just see the result, and you attribute the result to other things, the competition, the conditions, bad luck. You don't see the 14 months of running on a wrong assumption because you can't see what the assumption was hiding. Bertrand was quiet. The junior engineers were writing things down. Tobias was staring at the middle distance with the particular expression of someone rearranging the furniture of how they think about something. Elena looked up from her notes. "This is why you wrote the paper," she said. "What paper?" Bertrand asked. "He published a framework paper 9 years ago," Elena said, "about diagnostic blind spots in hybrid systems. It describes the category of fault he found in Monaco." She looked at Mason. "You were trying to get the industry to build the question into the process." "I was hoping," he said. Not bitterly, just honestly. "It didn't work." "Not very fast, no." "Why not?" He thought about it. "Because a paper about how your diagnostic system has invisible limits is, functionally, a paper about how to trust your systems less. And the industry's entire development trajectory for the past 20 years has been toward more systems, better systems, faster systems. The idea of deliberately trusting the systems less is," he paused, looking for the word, "it's philosophically opposite to the direction everyone's moving. So we trust the machines more, and the more we trust them, the less we can see what they miss," Elena said. "That's approximately it. That's an uncomfortable conclusion for a team that's spending $40 million a year on data infrastructure." "It's an uncomfortable conclusion for most teams," he said, "which is probably why the paper didn't move very fast." The session went 2 hours and 20 minutes, which was longer than the first one. Afterward, Vanessa walked with Mason to the building exit while the others drifted back to their work, carrying whatever they were carrying from the conversation. In the lobby, Mason stopped to zip his jacket. It was colder than February had any business being, even by English standards. Outside the glass doors, the car park was gray, and the sky was the specific flat white of a day that couldn't decide whether to rain. "Bertrand?" Mason said. "What about him?" "He's carrying that Silverstone thing." He pulled on his jacket collar. 3 years ago, and he still had it right there. He didn't have to think about it. "He's that kind of engineer. He keeps his mistakes." "That's not always a bad thing." He looked at the gray car park. "But it makes him risk-averse in a specific way. He won't trust junior analysis until he's run it twice, which means he slows down the people who might catch things he can't." Vanessa looked at him. "I know. You've seen it." "I've been managing around it for 2 years." She paused. "Is there a way to address it directly, without making it personal?" "Give him a junior engineer he trusts and tell him they're a team, not a hierarchy. Tell him the junior's job is to say what they see without filtering it, and his job is to take it seriously." He pushed the door open with his shoulder, letting in a wave of cold. "He'll push back. But if the junior actually finds something useful in the first month, he'll convert. He's the type." "You got all of that from 90 minutes in a room with him." "He told me himself," Mason said. "The Silverstone story. Everything I said about him was in that story. You just have to listen to what the story's actually telling you." He walked out into the cold. Vanessa watched him go to the car she'd arranged, one of the team's fleet cars, driver included, that would take him to the station, and get in without looking back. She stood in the lobby for a moment. She was thinking about what he'd said. Everything I said about him was in that story. She was thinking about all the stories she'd heard from her own people over the years, in performance reviews, in corridor conversations, in the particular unguarded moments that happen after long travel days when people say things they usually keep organized. She was thinking about how much she'd processed as information and how much she'd processed as story, and whether those were as different as she suspected they were. She went back to her office and made a note on her phone. B. Junior pairing. Find the right person. 3 weeks later, she assigned a young chassis engineer named Philippa Strand to work with Bertrand on the new floor development. She told Bertrand that Philippa was there to help him go faster, not to check his work. She told Philippa privately that her job was to say what she saw, every time, without editing it first. Philippa found a stress concentration in the floor's composite layup that the simulation hadn't flagged in her second week. Bertrand looked at it for a long time and then said, which was, for Bertrand, an exclamation. Vanessa heard about this from Chen, who heard it from Priya, and she thought about a man in a car park saying he's the type and being right. She did not call Mason to tell him. That felt like the wrong kind of thing to report. But she made another note on her phone, which she kept in a folder she'd created without quite deciding to create it, titled simply MR, because she'd started collecting things that were worth remembering. The thing about Mason Reed that Vanessa had not expected, because she had not thought to expect it, was that he was not consistent in the way that capable people are often consistent. The first 2 sessions had been, productive was too small a word for what had happened, but it was the available word. The conversations had moved things, had opened things, had produced in the engineers a quality of attention that Vanessa recognized as genuinely different from what they'd had before. She had started anticipating the 3rd session with the specific appetite of someone who has found a thing that works and wants more of it. The 3rd session was in May, preseason testing having concluded, and the first race of the new calendar 2 weeks away. She'd assembled 8 people this time, a mix of familiar and new faces, including Rohan Kapoor, who had said after the 2nd session that he wanted to come back, and 2 engineers from the race strategy team who hadn't been included before. Mason arrived and sat down and was fine. He was present, he was engaged, he asked good questions. But something was different, not broken, nothing was broken. The conversation was still useful, still did what it was supposed to do. But the quality of attention he'd had in the first 2 sessions, that precise focused thing that made the room reorganize itself around him, was slightly dimmer. Not gone. Just turned down. Vanessa noticed it. She suspected no one else did because no one else had the previous 2 sessions to compare it to. But she noticed. Afterward, when the room had cleared, she sat at the table across from him. He was drinking the last of his coffee. "Is everything okay?" she said. He looked at her. "What do you mean?" "You were a little bit elsewhere today." He didn't deny it. He set down the cup. He looked at the window where the May light was doing what May light did in England, trying harder than it could quite manage, still cold enough to matter. "Lily's been having a hard few weeks," he said. Vanessa waited. She's been asking about her mother more. She goes through periods of it. She's 9 now, and she's old enough to understand the shape of what she doesn't have, but not old enough to fully process it. So she asks questions, lots of questions. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "Most of them I can answer. Some of them I can't." "What kind of questions can't you answer?" He was quiet for a moment. What she would have been like. Whether she would have come to school events. Whether she would have liked the hedgehog. A short pause. "I can tell her what Sophie was like. I can't tell her who Sophie would have become because I don't know that. Nobody does. And Lily's starting to understand that there's a difference between the 2 things." Vanessa was quiet. The room had the specific stillness of a space that has held a loud conversation and is now holding a quiet one. "How do you answer the ones you can't answer?" she said. "I tell her the truth, that I don't know. That there are some questions where the honest answer is that nobody knows, and that's not the same as the question not mattering." He set the cup down. "She hates that answer. She's 9. She wants the question resolved, but she's also..." He paused. "She's also starting to understand that some things don't resolve. She's doing better with it than I would have at her age." "Better than most adults," Vanessa said. "Don't romanticize it." She cried for 40 minutes on a Tuesday because she found a photo of Sophie holding her as a newborn, and she'd never seen that specific photo before. He said it matter-of-factly, not as a performance of grief, but as the simple truth of what the week had contained. "It's not beautiful. It's just hard." "Yeah," Vanessa said. "Just that." He looked at the window again. "I told her the story of Monaco." This surprised Vanessa. "You did?" She kept asking what I did that day. She knew I helped someone with a car, but she wanted the details, so I told her. He almost smiled. She was most interested in the fact that there were 91 engineers, and none of them found it. What did she say? She said that 91 people looking at the same thing is basically the same as one person looking at it, because they'd all be looking the same way. He did smile then, briefly, with the specific quality of pride that parents have when children say things that are more right than expected. "She's 9. That's not bad." "That's not bad at all," Vanessa said. "I told her it was basically the lesson. She said she'd write it down." "Did she?" "Yeah." He shifted in his chair. She has a notebook she uses for things she wants to remember. She wrote, 91 people looking the same way is the same as one person. Her words, not mine. He looked at the table. I told her the actual lesson was slightly more specific than that, and she said hers was better. Vanessa laughed. It came out more genuinely than she'd expected. A short, real thing. She's probably right, Vanessa said. Probably. He stood, picking up his jacket from the back of the chair. I'm sorry if today wasn't what the last two were. It was useful, Vanessa said. Different useful, but useful. She paused. You don't owe me consistency. You're not on retainer. I know, but I said I'd do this, and when I do something, I do it properly. He pulled on his jacket. Next time I'll be more present. Next time bring Lily if you want. He looked at her. She'd ask everyone very pointed questions and take notes. I know, that's why I said it. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she'd seen once or twice now. The expression of someone recalibrating a person they've been thinking about in one dimension and discovering a different one. Maybe, he said. He left. Vanessa sat at the table alone for a while, in the May light, thinking about a 9-year-old girl with a notebook and her own version of the lesson. She thought, 91 people looking the same way is the same as one person. She thought about every meeting she'd sat in over 20 years, where every person in the room had the same background, the same training, the same set of assumptions, every design review, every strategy session, every crisis response. She opened her phone. She added to the MR folder, diversity of perspective isn't a value, it's a diagnostic tool. Then she wrote a separate note to herself. Next engineering leadership offsite. Break the room by assumption, not by seniority. She'd been running leadership sessions for 8 years with the same structure. Senior people together, junior people separate, because seniority had experience that the juniors needed to absorb. The logic had always made sense to her. She sat there thinking about whether the logic was the end plate and whether the real problem was somewhere else. June came, and with it, the season's second race, which took place on a street circuit in a different city from Monaco, but with the same quality of compressed, unforgiving asphalt that made street circuits the particular test they were. Blackwood Motorsport ran well. 3rd place for Kai Nakamura. Consistent points. No drama. The championship was early, and the standings were tight in the way early season standings are always tight, before the pattern of the year begins to emerge. Mason watched the race on television in his shop, between a brake job on a Range Rover and a coolant flush on a 12-year-old Honda. The television was a small one, mounted high on the wall near the ceiling, and he watched it the way he always watched racing now, at a distance, with the attention of someone who knows the language but no longer needs to be inside it. He watched Kai Nakamura's opening stint with specific interest. The car moved differently than it had at the end of the previous season. The new chassis had a different characteristic in the slow corners, a slightly different weight balance through the entry phase. Mason could see it in the way the car rotated through turn 7. Bertrand's floor development, maybe, or the suspension geometry changes Chen had described during the February session. The coolant flush took 40 minutes. By the time he finished, the race was in the final phase and Kai was holding 3rd. Mason watched the last 8 laps while writing up the Honda's service record. When the checkered flag fell, he turned the television off. The shop was quiet. Monaco street noise outside reduced on this particular Tuesday afternoon because the racing world was in a different city and the tourists who followed it had followed it there. He sat at his workbench for a moment with the service record in front of him, thinking about the floor characteristic he'd seen in turn 7 and whether it was a deliberate setup choice or a development limitation they hadn't solved yet. He picked up his phone. He almost called Vanessa. He put it down. There was a line between the thing he'd agreed to do, show up twice a year, ask different questions, help people think differently about problems, and the thing he'd declined to do, which was become part of the team again in the way that meant being part of the team. The line was not always in the same place. It moved depending on the day and the question, but it was there. He put the phone in his pocket and went to start on the next job. The next job was a 2009 Renault Megane, whose owner, a 60-year-old Monegasque man named Alain, brought it in every 6 months with a different thing that needed attention and stayed an hour longer than necessary to talk about whatever Alain wanted to talk about, which today was the racing season, and specifically the new Blackwood car. "I saw you watching," Alain said, gesturing at the blank television. He'd been in the waiting area during the Honda job. "Old habit," Mason said, moving around to the Méjean's driver's side. "You used to work with racing cars." Alain said this as fact, not question. He'd lived in Monaco long enough to absorb its particular community texture, the way every person had a story that the city knew and the city kept. "A while ago." "The Blackwood car, the one that wouldn't start in Monaco." Mason glanced at him. "You heard about that." "Everyone heard about that. The mechanic who came and fixed it." Alain tilted his head with the frank curiosity of a man who has reached the age where he asks what he wants to ask. "Was that you?" Mason opened the Méjean's hood. "Let me look at your coolant reservoir first. You said it's been low." Alain accepted this non-answer with good grace. He sat on the plastic chair in the corner that existed specifically for customers who wanted to watch and talk. He said nothing for a while. Then, "My son watches racing. He's 19. He wants to be an engineer, racing engineer." Alain said it with the pride and uncertainty of a parent whose child has chosen something specific and distant. "Is it a good life?" Mason was looking at the coolant reservoir. "It depends on what you want from a life." He wants to be around the cars, around the problem solving. "Then there are worse ways to spend your time." He straightened. "The coolant's fine, actually. Just looks low because of the expansion. You've probably got a small air pocket in the system. I'll bleed it." "What did you want from life?" Alain asked. "When you were his age?" Mason considered declining this question too. He didn't. "The same as your son, the problem solving." He moved to get the bleeding kit. "I got it, for a while." "And now?" "Now I bleed Renault cooling systems." He said it without irony, which was its own kind of answer. Alain looked at the car, then at Mason. "Is that enough?" Mason attached the bleeding kit. He started the process, which required a few minutes of mechanical attention. Alain waited. "Some days more than others," Mason said eventually. "Honestly, today it is." Alain nodded. He seemed to find this a satisfactory answer, or at least an honest one, which he appeared to value equally. He asked no more questions on the subject. He talked about his son. The boy's name was Marc. He was studying mechanical engineering in Lyon. He'd been watching racing since he was 6. Mason listened while he worked, in the way he listened to things that weren't his problem but were worth hearing. When the job was done, Alain paid and drove away in the Méjean, and the shop went quiet again. Mason stood in the bay door for a moment, looking at the street. Late afternoon Monaco. The light at this hour came between the buildings at an angle that made everything slightly golden, which was probably why people paid so much to live here. This particular quality of late light. He thought about Alain's question. Is it enough? He thought about it honestly, the way he tried to think about most things, without performing an answer, without reaching for the one that sounded right. Some days the repair shop was exactly what it needed to be, concrete and immediate, a problem with a solution, a person helped, a thing working that hadn't been working. Some days it was small in a way that he could feel, a smallness that wasn't quite regret, but pressed against regret the way two things can be adjacent without being the same. Those days were less frequent than they'd been at first. At first, the first year after he left the sport, when Lily was 2 and the world was strange with grief and change, those days had been most days. Now they were occasional, manageable. He'd built enough of the right things around him that the occasional smallness had context to exist within. He went inside and started on the paperwork. But it was Lily who brought Mason back to Vanessa in the end. Not intentionally, not through anything she did, but through the notebook. In late June, 3 weeks before the 4th racing session of the season, and about 6 weeks before Mason was scheduled to come in for the 4th conversation with the Blackwood engineers, Lily came home from school with a school project assignment. The assignment was for something called a living history portfolio. Each student in her class was supposed to interview an adult in their life about something they'd learned from their work and compile it into a presentation. Lily chose Mason. He found out about this the way he found out about most of Lily's projects, which was when she appeared in front of him while he was doing something else, and said, I need to ask you some questions for school, with the particular urgency of a child who has already organized the activity in her head and is now executing it. It was a Sunday afternoon. He was reorganizing the supply cabinet, which he did about once every 3 months, and which never quite worked the way he intended. "For school," he said, "for my living history project." She had the notebook, the one she'd described using to write down things she wanted to remember. It was a standard composition notebook, dark blue, with a strip of tape on the front where she'd written her name in the careful block letters she'd developed in 2nd grade and mostly maintained since. "I have 8 questions. 8. I might add more depending on your answers." He put down the supply he'd been holding. "Okay." She sat cross-legged on the floor of the shop, which was not a sanitary surface for sitting, and he did not say this because she was already settled and had the notebook open and a pen in her hand. He sat on his rolling stool. "Question 1, she said. What is the most important thing you've learned from your work?" He thought about this genuinely. That the most useful question is usually the simplest one. What happened? Not what should have happened, not what the data shows happened, what actually happened, in order. She wrote this down with great concentration. Question 2. What is something that you used to think was true that turned out to be wrong? That being the smartest person in the room is an advantage. She looked up. Is it not? Being the smartest person in the room is useful for solving the problems you already know how to solve. It can make it harder to see problems you've never encountered, because your brain wants to fit the new thing into a shape it already understands. She wrote this down. He could see her working it out, the slight frown of someone encoding a concept. Question 3. What is something you're not good at? He almost said something modest and deflective. He didn't. Letting things go. When I've identified a problem I can solve, I have difficulty accepting that solving it isn't my job. I can see what needs to be fixed, and I have to choose not to fix it. And I'm not always good at it. Lily regarded him with the evaluative look. Is that about me or about work? He looked at his daughter, 9 years old. Both, he said. Okay, she said, and wrote it down. The interview continued for 45 minutes. She asked about mistakes. He told her about the first team, the floor seal he'd spent 3 weeks looking for in the wrong place. She asked about the thing he was most proud of. He thought about it for a long time and said, showing up here every day and having you show up too. She made a face that was 9 years of opinions about her father condensed into one expression and said, that's a dad answer, I need a work answer. He said, the paper I wrote, even if it didn't change very much very fast. I said something true about something and I said it clearly. She wrote this down with visible approval. She asked about Monaco last. Tell me about the car, she said. He told her about the car. He went through it in more detail than he had before. Not the technical elements, which she mostly followed with approximate understanding, but the sequence, the clock, the engineers, the flashlight, the grounding lug, the engine firing. She listened without interrupting, which was not her default mode. She wrote things in the notebook as he talked. When he finished, she looked at her notes for a moment. Then she said, why did you see it when nobody else did? Because I didn't know what I was looking for, he said. I only knew what had happened. So I followed the sequence and I looked where the sequence led. She wrote, followed the sequence and looked where it led. Is that what the lesson is? She said. The real one? The real one, Tet, he said, is that the answer isn't always hidden. Sometimes everyone just stops looking. She wrote that down in the notebook. Slowly, carefully, as if she was writing something she was going to keep, which she was. 3 weeks later, she gave her living history presentation to her class. Mason was not there. The presentation was during school hours, and he had a job he couldn't move. But her teacher, a warm and precisely organized woman named Madame Fournier, sent him an email that evening. Dear Mr. Reed, it read, Lily gave her presentation today. It was without question the most thoughtful presentation in the class. I wanted you to know. She spoke for 12 minutes without notes. The other children were very quiet. She ended by reading something from her notebook, which she said was a lesson you taught her. I wanted to write it down exactly as she said it. The answer isn't always hidden. Sometimes everyone just stops looking. My dad taught me this because he saved a race car that 91 engineers couldn't fix. But he says the most important thing he ever fixed wasn't the car. I asked her what the most important thing was. She said, me. After my mom died, he fixed our life. I thought you should know she said this. Mason read the email standing up, still in his work clothes, in the kitchen of the apartment above the shop, with the evening light coming through the window at the angle it came through in late summer. He read it twice. He did not cry. He was not the kind of person who cried easily, and also he was in the kitchen and Lily was in the next room, and if he cried she would know and she would ask, and he would have to explain, which would mean explaining what Madame Fournier had written, which he was not ready to do. He put his phone in his pocket. He went to the refrigerator and stood in front of it for a while, not looking for anything specific, just doing the thing people do when they need a moment, and the refrigerator is a socially acceptable reason to pause. Then he went to Lily's room and knocked. What? She said, which was how she said yes. He opened the door. She was on her bed doing homework, the notebook open beside her, though she appeared to be working on something different. How was the presentation? He said. She looked up. She had the expression of a person who had already processed the event and moved on to the next thing, but was willing to return to it briefly. Good. Mathieu asked 3 questions, and Madame Fournier said that meant it was interesting. What questions did Mathieu ask? He wanted to know how big the garage was, how much the car cost, and whether you got paid. Mason looked at his daughter. Did you tell him? I said the garage was big, the car cost more than our building, and you didn't get paid. She tilted her head. Should you have gotten paid? No, he said. She seemed to find this satisfactory. She went back to her homework. He stood in the doorway a moment longer. The room was the room he'd helped her decorate 2 years ago. A project that had taken 3 weekends and produced a result that was entirely hers, in colors she'd chosen with total confidence and no artistic justification. On her wall, the larger crayon drawing of car number 7 was still there, taped up beside a poster of a deep-sea creature she'd been briefly obsessed with in March. Lily, he said. What? I'm proud of you. She looked up. She had the expression of someone receiving something genuine and processing it as such, without deflection. I know, she said. You always say that. It's always true. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she went back to her homework. He went back to the kitchen. He took out his phone. He opened the MR folder on Vanessa's phone, and he thought about that. Then he opened his own contacts and found Vanessa's number and typed, Lily gave her school presentation today. She used the Monaco story. Her version of the lesson was better than mine. He sent it before he could second-guess the sending. The reply came back in 4 minutes. What was her version? He typed it out. 91 people looking the same way is the same as one person. A pause. Then, she's right, I know, he typed. Another pause, longer this time. Then, I've been thinking about the next session. I want to try something different. Bring her if you're willing. I think she'd ask the right questions. He looked at his phone for a moment. He looked at the wall between the kitchen and Lily's room, through which he could hear the faint sound of pencil on paper. He thought about lines, about the ones you draw and the ones you move, and the ones that were never quite where you thought they were. He typed, I'll ask her. She'll probably say yes. She sounds like someone who knows what she wants, Vanessa wrote. She gets that from her mother, he typed. Then, after a second, and a little bit from me. He put the phone down on the counter. Outside, Monaco did what Monaco did in the evening, compressed the light, and made everything the color of something worth looking at. He stood there in his kitchen, in his life, in the particular quiet that follows a day that has had more in it than you expected. He was not, by his own assessment, a man who had everything. He was a man who had the things he'd chosen, which was a different category and, most of the time, a better one. The pencil sound from Lily's room stopped. Then, Dad, can I have a snack? After dinner? That's not a no. It's a not yet. A pause. Then the pencil sound resumed. He started making dinner. Lily said yes, which Mason had predicted, but the way she said it surprised him. He'd expected enthusiasm. She was 9. and the idea of visiting a Formula racing team's technical facility was objectively the kind of thing a 9-year-old who had been drawing race cars in crayon for a year would find exciting. What he hadn't expected was the specific, considered quality of her yes. He'd explained it to her over dinner the following week, keeping it simple. There was a team of engineers who were working on hard problems, and they sometimes talked with him about how to think about those problems. And Vanessa, the woman who ran the team, had asked if Lily wanted to come. Lily had listened to this with her fork stopped halfway to her mouth. "Why does she want me there?" she said. "Because of what you said in your presentation, your version of the lesson." She thought about this. "She thinks I know something they don't. She thinks you might ask different questions." Lily set her fork down and looked at the table for a moment with the expression she used when she was taking something seriously rather than just deciding quickly. "Okay," she said, "but I'm going to actually ask questions, not just be there." "That's the idea." "Okay then." She picked her fork back up. "Can I bring the notebook?" He said yes. Of course he said yes. The fourth session was scheduled for a Saturday in late August, which Vanessa had arranged specifically so that Lily's school attendance wasn't an issue. The team's technical facility outside London ran on reduced staff on Saturdays. The race engineers were at the current circuit in Hungary for a race weekend. The development team was working on the next specification. The building was occupied, but not at full operational pressure. Vanessa had chosen this deliberately. She didn't want the weight of a full working week pressing on a room that she wanted to keep open. She'd also chosen the people differently this time. Not the most senior engineers. They'd had their turns in previous sessions. This time she'd assembled the youngest cohort, Tobias Weir, now in his second year with the team, and no longer quite as dazed about the job being real. Philippa Strand, Bertrand's junior engineer who had found the composite stress concentration, and who had been, since then, the kind of person who said what she saw without the usual filtering. 2 graduate engineers who joined in September and who were at the stage where they knew enough to be dangerous, but not yet enough to be certain. And Simone Faure, who was not young in tenure, but was young in the way of people who haven't yet calcified around their own expertise. 8 people, plus Vanessa, plus Mason, plus one 9-year-old with a composition notebook. Mason drove to London this time rather than taking the train. He drove the Peugeot, which meant the journey took 2 hours and 40 minutes and involved a stop at a service station where Lily consumed a hot chocolate and studied the other cars in the car park with the specific attention she brought to things that had moving parts. "That one has a cracked CV boot," she said, pointing at a silver hatchback 3 spaces over. Mason looked. She was right. The small, accordion-like rubber boot on the front axle was visibly split, grease beginning to show at the tear. "Good eye," he said. "You pointed one out to me in October." She said this matter-of-factly. She had a good memory for things she'd decided to keep. "Do you think the owner knows?" "Probably not." She looked at the car, then at him. "Should we tell them?" He considered it. "Do you see them?" They looked around. The car appeared to be unoccupied, its owner presumably inside the service station. "We could leave a note," Lily said. They left a note. Mason wrote it on the back of a receipt from the service station. CV boot cracked, front right axle, worth getting looked at before it fails, and tucked it under the windshield wiper. Lily watched this with the satisfaction of someone who has correctly identified a problem and done something about it. "We didn't have to do that," he said, getting back in the Peugeot. "I know," she said, "but the answer was right there." He pulled out of the service station and merged back onto the motorway. He thought, 91 people looking the same way is the same as one person. He thought about what it meant that he'd raised a child who left notes about CV boots on strangers' cars, and whether that was a thing he'd taught her or a thing she'd arrived at herself. Probably both. Probably neither. Probably it was just who she was, built from the parts of 2 people and the years and the particular apartment above the repair shop where she'd grown up watching someone fix things. He drove. The building impressed Lily, which she did not say, but which Mason could read in the way her head moved when they walked through the lobby, taking in the ceiling height, the materials, the photographs on the walls that documented 15 years of the team's history in circuits and garages and pit lanes. She looked at everything the way she always looked at new things, systematically, without performing amazement. Vanessa met them in the lobby. She was dressed differently than she'd been in Monaco or in London. Casual, a dark sweater and trousers, no jacket. It was Saturday, and the building was at half capacity, and she'd dressed for the building as it was rather than as it usually was. Mason noticed this and thought it was the right call. She crouched slightly when she met Lily. Not in the exaggerated way that adults sometimes do with children, compressing themselves into false smallness, but genuinely adjusting to the eye level, the way you do when you mean the conversation to be between equals. "I'm Vanessa," she said. "I know," Lily said. "You're the one who runs the team." "I am." "Did you build it or inherit it?" Vanessa blinked. "Both," she said. "My father built it. I've been running it for 8 years. Is that harder? Inheriting something. Because you have to be good enough for it, but also different enough to make it yours." Vanessa looked at Mason. He looked back at her with the expression of someone who has presented a natural phenomenon and is waiting to see how it's received. "Yes," Vanessa said to Lily. "That's exactly what it's like." Lily nodded. She wrote something in the notebook. Vanessa watched this with the expression of someone recalibrating their expectations for the next several hours. They took the elevator to the 3rd floor. The room was as it always was. Long table, windows, coffee setup. The 8 engineers were already there, and they did what people do when a child enters a professional space. They adjusted, some more naturally than others. Tobias Weir immediately moved his laptop to make room and said, "Hey, cool notebook," which Lily accepted without comment. The 2 graduate engineers, a man named Declan, who was 24 and Irish, and a woman named Una, who was 23 and had come from Seoul via Imperial College, looked at each other with the particular expression of people who hadn't fully understood the session format from the briefing and were now encountering the reality. Simone Four smiled at Lily and said, "I heard about your presentation." And Lily said, "Did my dad tell you?" And Simone said, "Vanessa told me." And Lily glanced at Vanessa with a look that was not quite suspicious, but was gathering information. Philippa Strand said nothing, but she moved her chair slightly to make a clear space beside her at the table and left it there, which Lily noticed and took. Mason sat at the center of the table. Lily sat beside Philippa. Vanessa took the end opposite the windows. "I thought we'd try something different today," Vanessa said without preamble. "Instead of starting with a problem, I'd like to start with a question from Lily." Everyone looked at Lily. Lily was ready. She had the notebook open. "I have a question for everyone," she said. Her voice was the voice of a child, which meant it was smaller than the room, but she spoke without hesitancy. "What's the last thing you were wrong about at work? And how did you find out you were wrong?" The room received this. Tobias said, "Oh, that's a good one," almost immediately, which broke something loose. Declan went first. He'd been wrong about a software optimization that he'd been certain would reduce simulation processing time. It had, but it had also introduced a rounding error in the output that had taken 3 weeks to catch because the error was small enough to look like normal variation. He'd found out when Una, cross-checking an output against a hand calculation, had flagged a number that didn't quite fit. "How did Una know to do the hand calculation?" Lily asked. Declan looked at Una. "She was being thorough," he said. "Was she checking your work specifically?" "No, she was checking the model generally." "So she found it by accident?" "I guess, yeah." "If she hadn't done that calculation, would you have found it another way?" Declan thought about it. "Eventually, when the results diverged from real-world testing." "How long would that have taken?" "Maybe 3 months? Maybe longer." Lily wrote something in the notebook. "Thank you," she said. Una went next. She'd been wrong about an aerodynamic load assumption that had informed a wing specification. The assumption was correct in isolation, but failed to account for an interaction effect with the floor when the car was in dirty air behind another car. She'd found out when Alexandre Petit, the test driver, had reported a handling characteristic that didn't match the model's prediction. "When he reported it, did you believe him right away?" Lily asked. Una paused. "Not immediately," she said carefully. "Why not?" "Because the model was very complete. I trusted the model. More than you trusted him? More than I trusted my uncertainty about the model, yes. Is that the same thing? Una looked at the table. No, she said. It's not. Mason watched this happening. Lily was 9 and she was doing naturally and without any framework exactly the thing he'd spent 4 sessions trying to describe. She was following the sequence. She was asking what happened. She was not accepting the first answer as the complete one. She was doing it without knowing she was doing it. She was just curious, and curiosity in a room full of experts was a diagnostic instrument of exceptional sensitivity. Simone told her story next. The drag model, the CFD calibration error, the 14 months of running on a wrong assumption. Lily listened to the whole thing and then asked, "When you found it, were you angry at yourself?" "Yes," Simone said. "For how long?" "About a week, if I'm honest." "And then?" "And then I fixed it and moved on." "My dad says the mistake isn't the problem," Lily said. "Not finding it is the problem." She glanced at Mason. "Is that what he tells your engineers too?" "Something like that," Simone said. She was looking at Lily with an expression that was professional and also genuinely delighted, the expression of someone who has been asked a child's question and discovered it was the adult question they'd been avoiding. Philippa's turn came and she talked about the end plate assumption, Bertrand's end plate assumption, though she was careful not to use his name, which Mason noticed and respected. She described the 4 days of trying to raise the floor seal possibility and being redirected to the end plate, and the moment when she'd shown it in the visualization data and the response had been silence. "What did silence feel like?" Lily asked. Philippa looked at her. "What do you mean?" "When you showed them and they were silent, what did it feel like?" A pause. "Like I might be wrong even though I was right," Philippa said. "Like being certain and uncertain at the same time." Lily wrote this down. Mason could see the words from where he sat, certain and uncertain at the same time. When you know something the room doesn't believe yet. "That happens to me at school," Lily said. "When I know the answer but the teacher hasn't called on me yet." She looked at Philippa. "What did you do?" "I showed it again, with more data." "Did that work?" "Eventually." "How many times did you show it?" 3. "Would it have been okay to stop after 2? Philippa thought about this carefully. "Probably not. The 3rd time I had an extra camera angle that made it unambiguous," she paused. "Though I almost didn't do the 3rd time. I was starting to doubt myself." "But you did it anyway." "Yeah." Lily wrote, "Show it again even when you're starting to doubt yourself." She underlined it twice. Philippa watched this and didn't say anything, but she reached over and adjusted Lily's notebook angle slightly. Not to read it, just a gesture of companionship, and Lily let her. Tobias went last. He told a story about a simulation parameter he'd set incorrectly for 6 weeks of a development program, a mistake that had been his and nobody else's, that he'd found by going back to reread documentation he thought he already knew. "Why did you go back to the documentation?" Lily asked. "Because something felt off. A result that was technically correct but didn't match my intuition about how the system should behave." "What's intuition?" she asked. Not because she didn't know the word, Mason sensed, but because she wanted Tobias's definition of it in context. A feeling based on experience. When you've worked with something long enough, you develop a sense of how it should behave. When it doesn't match that sense, it doesn't always mean something is wrong. But it's worth checking. Is intuition more reliable or less reliable than instruments? Neither, Tobias said. Different. The instruments tell you what the measurements say. The intuition tells you when to distrust the measurements. Lily thought about this. My dad said something like that. He said instruments show what they were built to see. She looked at Tobias. Is that the same as intuition being the thing that sees what they weren't built to see? The room was quiet for a moment. Tobias said, Yeah, that's actually a really clean way to put it. I got it from my dad, Lily said. I know, Tobias said, but you made it cleaner. Mason looked at the table. He was not going to smile in a room full of people because his daughter had articulated something more precisely than he had. He was not. He looked at the table very carefully. They broke for lunch at 12:30. Vanessa had arranged food, sandwiches, fruit, the kind of practical catering that was about sustenance rather than experience. They ate in the room, conversation fragmenting into smaller pieces, the specific social physics of a group that has been in structured conversation and is now off duty. Lily ate half a sandwich and spent the rest of the break talking to Philippa, which Mason observed from across the table where he was in conversation with Simone about the wind tunnel testing schedule. He couldn't hear what Lily and Philippa were saying. The table was long, and the ambient sound absorbed the specifics. But he could see that Lily was asking questions with the notebook open, and Philippa was answering them, leaning slightly forward in the posture of someone who has found a conversation unexpectedly interesting. He looked away when he realized he was watching. Simone had been talking about a specific corner characteristic in the new car's balance, a tendency she'd noticed in the simulation data that didn't have a clear explanation yet. She'd been describing it for 2 minutes, and Mason had been listening with part of his attention, and now she stopped and looked at him. "I've been describing this to Chen for 3 weeks," she said. "He thinks it's a damper characteristic." "But you don't." "The damper explanation fits about 80% of the behavior. The other 20% doesn't match." "What does the other 20% look like?" She described it. Mason listened. He thought about it for a moment. The specific characteristics she was describing, the way she'd couched the behavior, what she'd said about the conditions under which it appeared. "It sounds like it's load-dependent," he said, "not speed-dependent." She went still. "Say more." "The 20% that doesn't match the damper explanation, does it occur in the corners where the vertical load is highest, independent of speed?" She looked at him. Her expression was the expression of someone running something in their head quickly. "Yes. I think, yes. The 2 occasions where it's most pronounced are both high-load, slow corners. Then it's probably not the damper. Dampers work with velocity. What you're describing sounds more like a structural compliance issue, something in the chassis or the suspension geometry that deforms under high load and changes the effective geometry momentarily. A structural flex? Or a bearing preload that's been set slightly off?" He picked up a water bottle. "I don't know your car well enough to be specific, but the load dependency is the tell. Chase the load, not the speed." Simone was quiet for a moment. "I need to go pull the load data by corner specifically, not by speed." "Yeah," she wrote on her phone. Then she looked at him. "You see these things very fast." "I'm not in the problem," he said. "You've been looking at it for 3 weeks. I heard it for 2 minutes. Fresh eyes." Lily would say we all needed to look differently. Lily would be right. Simone looked across the table at Lily, who was now showing Philippa something in the notebook. A specific page, tracing something with her finger. "She's remarkable," Simone said. "I don't mean that as a compliment to you. I mean it as a plain statement of fact." "I know," Mason said. "I know what you mean." After lunch, the session reconvened and shifted. Less structured now, conversation moving where it wanted to move. Vanessa facilitated this with the specific skill of someone who knows when to shape a conversation and when to let it shape itself. Lily rejoined the table but was quieter in this phase, listening more than asking. The notebook still open, but her pen used less frequently. She was filling in something, Mason thought, taking the raw material from the morning and doing something with it internally that hadn't finished yet. At one point, Declan asked Mason a direct question about the Cavalier investigation, not confrontationally, with genuine curiosity. He'd looked up the history after hearing Mason mentioned in the context of previous teams, and he wanted to know what the investigation had been like from inside. Mason looked at him. Declan was 24 and earnest in the way of people who don't yet know enough to be strategic about their curiosity. "It was a bad year," Mason said. "The allegations were wrong, but the investigation was real and it had real consequences. People left who didn't need to leave. The team contracted." "Did it affect your work?" "Everything affects your work. You don't stop doing the job, but you're doing it in a building where everyone's carrying something extra, and that changes the quality of thinking in ways that are hard to measure." "Is that why you left?" "I left because my wife died that year. The investigation made the timing possible, but it wasn't the cause." He said this in the even way he'd developed for it, not hiding anything, not performing anything. I wasn't going to keep traveling 8 months a year with a 2-year-old and no partner. The math didn't work. Do you miss it? Declan asked. The team environment, not the travel. Mason looked at the room. He looked at the windows. He looked at the engineers around the table, these people who had spent a morning opening their mistakes to a 9-year-old with a composition notebook, and who had done it with more honesty than most adults managed in rooms where the stakes were supposed to be higher. Yes, he said, honestly. Not always, but yes. Lily looked at him when he said this, just a glance. She looked back at her notebook. He thought, she heard that. She's filing it. She'll come back to it later. He thought, that's fine. It's true. She can have the truth. The session ended at 4 in the afternoon. People gathered their things with the slow drift of a group that has been in a good conversation and doesn't want to admit it's finished. Tobias asked Lily if she was going to come back, which she said she'd think about, which Tobias correctly identified as meaning, probably yes. Philippa said she hoped to see her again, and Lily said, I'll send you the page from my notebook when I finish it, which was the closest she came to warmth in the way children show warmth, through the giving of something. Vanessa walked with Mason and Lily to the lobby. In the elevator, Lily said, Philippa was almost right the third time, but she almost stopped at 2. I know, Mason said. That's important. The almost stopping. She looked at the elevator doors. The answer was there the third time. If she'd stopped at 2, nobody would have found it. Right. So persistence is part of the diagnostic process, she said. Not just seeing correctly, continuing to show the thing you see even when people aren't ready to see it yet. The elevator opened. They walked out. Vanessa said quietly, she should write that down. She already did, Mason said, while Philippa was talking. They stood in the lobby for a moment. The building was quieter now than the morning, the reduced Saturday staff further reduced by the end of the working day. Outside, through the glass, the August evening was doing what August evenings did in England, lasting longer than expected, the light refusing to give up the way summer light refused to give up here, holding on past 8, past 9, one of the compensations the climate offered for everything else it withheld. Thank you, Vanessa said. She said it to both of them, but she looked at Lily when she said it. Lily received this with the slight surprise of a child who has been thanked by an adult and isn't entirely sure what for. I just asked questions, she said. That's what I'm thanking you for. Lily looked at her notebook, then at Vanessa. My dad says the most important question is usually the simplest one. What happened? Not what should have happened. He's told me that. Do you do it? Vanessa considered this. Better than I did a year ago. Is it hard? When you're in charge? What do you mean? Being in charge means everyone's looking at you for the answer, so when you don't know, is that harder to say? Vanessa was quiet for a moment. She had the expression of someone encountering a question they'd thought about and hadn't finished thinking about. Yes, she said, it's harder. Because the people around you need confidence, and admitting uncertainty can feel like you're taking something from them. But if you pretend to be certain when you're not, they might look in the wrong place. Yes. So the cost of false certainty is that everyone follows you the wrong way. Essentially, yes. Lily looked at the floor for a second. That's the most important version of the lesson, she said. The Monaco thing worked because my dad wasn't certain about what the problem was. He was only certain about the process. Follow the sequence, that's different. She said this without performance, without emphasis. She said it the way she said most things, as if it was simply the thing that was true, waiting to be said. The lobby was quiet. Outside, a car moved slowly past the glass front of the building. Vanessa looked at Mason. He looked back at her. I've been trying to say that for 4 sessions, he said. I know, Vanessa said. She said it in 30 seconds. She had better source material. Lily had already moved toward the exit. Dad, the drive is 2 hours, 40 minutes. I know. It's 4:15. I know, Lily. We'll get home at 7. That's late for a school night. It's Saturday. There's no school tomorrow. She appeared to do the calendar calculation. Oh, she said. Right. She looked at Vanessa. Can I come back? Any time, Vanessa said. Would it be useful or just interesting? Both. Lily appeared to find this a satisfactory answer. She pushed through the lobby door into the August evening. Mason held the door for a second longer. Simone's corner characteristic, he said to Vanessa. It's probably a structural compliance issue. Load dependent, not speed dependent. Tell her to look at the high load, slow corners specifically and map the geometry deviation under load. Vanessa made a note on her phone. You could tell her yourself. I just did, through you. He let the door go. Good session. He walked out. The drive back was longer than the drive there, because the M25 in the early evening was the M25 in the early evening, which was a condition of existence that Southern England had accepted and built its infrastructure around. They sat in traffic for 40 minutes outside the orbital junction, the Peugeot surrounded by vehicles that were also going somewhere slowly. Lily used this time to write in the notebook. The overhead courtesy light on her side, she'd pushed the button for it without asking, which was within the established parameters of their arrangement, cast a warm yellow light over the page in her hand and the careful block letters she was still producing 6 years after learning them. Mason drove and didn't ask what she was writing. She'd show him if she wanted to. She usually did, eventually. Past the orbital junction, the traffic broke and they moved at speed, the Peugeot somewhat complainingly but effectively. The sun was still above the horizon, barely August, and the motorway stretched out in the particular featureless way of motorways that look the same from anywhere on them. Can I ask you something? Lily said. She was still writing but had slowed. Yeah. You said today that you miss it. You'd been waiting for this. Yeah. The team environment. Yeah. But you still don't want to go back. No? Why not, if you miss it? He thought about this carefully because she was asking it carefully. The way she asked things she actually wanted to understand. Because missing something and wanting it back are different, he said. Sometimes you can love something and also know that it's not right for your life. The missing doesn't go away, but that doesn't mean the leaving was wrong. She was quiet for a moment. Do you miss Mom like that? He kept his eyes on the road. Yes. You love her, and you know she's not coming back, so you're not waiting for her, but you still miss her. Yeah, that's right. So the missing is just part of having had something. Yeah. He paused. That's a good way to put it. She considered this. She went back to writing. After a few minutes, I don't remember missing her. I remember missing the idea of her. She said it without distress, in the matter-of-fact tone she used for things she'd thought about enough to have settled. Is that the same thing? No, he said. But it's real. The missing is real either way. Yeah. She closed the notebook. Madame Fournier says grief is different for everyone. She said some people miss what they had, and some people miss what they were supposed to have. Which one are you? The second one, she said. Is that okay? It's honest, he said. That's better than okay. She leaned her head against the window. The glass was cool, and the evening was warm, and the combination apparently felt good because she stayed there. Dad? Yeah. Vanessa's good at her job, but she's lonely. He glanced at her. What makes you say that? She talks to everyone like she's responsible for them. She's always a little bit behind a window. Lily said this with her eyes on the road ahead, head still against the glass. Even when she's being nice, like she's used to being watched and she can't fully stop. He didn't say anything for a moment. You got all that from one afternoon. I got it from the way she listened. She listened hard because she doesn't get to be listened to very often. A pause. You listen to me all the time. She doesn't have someone who listens to her all the time. He thought about Vanessa on the pit wall in Monaco, in the repair shop, asking honest questions, in the car park in the November cold outside the London train station. He thought about a woman who had built something significant and held it together and who said thank you to a 9-year-old with genuine weight behind it, because she didn't receive thanks very often and wasn't sure what to do with it. You might be right, he said. I usually am, Lily said, and he could hear in her voice that she was half joking, which meant she was half not. They drove the rest of the way in companionable quiet. Lily fell asleep somewhere past the Channel Tunnel terminal, her head still against the window, the notebook on her lap. Mason drove. The Peugeot did its best. The night came down the way it came down in late August, reluctantly, as if it hadn't quite made up its mind yet. He thought about the session, about Declan and Una and Philippa, and what each of them had produced when asked to describe the last time they were wrong. He thought about the specific quality of honesty that the question had generated, honest in the way that rooms were sometimes honest when the frame around the conversation was different enough to make the usual defenses irrelevant. Lily had done that. She'd walked in with a composition notebook and 9 years of unfiltered curiosity, and the room had responded to it the way rooms responded to disarming things. He thought about what she'd said about Vanessa. He thought about his own loneliness, which he didn't think about often or productively, but which was there the way things are there when you've decided not to look at them directly. Not the social loneliness of someone without connections. He had people, the Monegasques who brought their cars and stayed too long, the teachers at Lily's school who'd known him for years now, the occasional phone call with his brother in Toulouse. Not that. The other kind. The kind that comes from having been deeply known by one person and then having that knowing removed and finding that the space it occupied doesn't fill back in the same way. Sophie had died 9 years ago. He knew her for 6 years before that. He'd known her longer in memory than he'd known her in life, which was a mathematics he still hadn't fully reconciled with. He drove the last 30 miles thinking about this and not thinking about it, the way you could do on a motorway when the road was simple enough to handle without all of your attention. When he pulled onto Rue de la Condamine, the apartment building was lit from within, the warm, domestic light of occupied spaces. He parked and sat for a moment before getting out. Lily woke when the engine stopped. She had the brief disorientation of someone returning from sleep and then assembled herself quickly, the way she always did. She looked at him. "We're home," she said. "We're home." She picked up the notebook. She looked at the building, then she looked at him with the slightly searching quality she sometimes had when she was reading something in his face that he hadn't said. "Are you okay?" she asked. "Yeah," he said. "Tired." She looked at him a moment longer. "Okay," she said, and she got out of the car. He got out. He locked it. He followed her into the building and up the stairs and into the apartment where the specific smell of their specific life settled around him. The faint mechanical smell from the shop below, the cooking smells from dinner 2 days ago still ghost-present in the kitchen air, the particular scent of Lily's room that he could not have described to anyone but would have recognized anywhere. She went to brush her teeth. He stood in the kitchen and drank a glass of water. On the refrigerator, held by a magnet shaped like a car, was the drawing she'd made of car number 7, the big one, with the 7 on the side. Below it, more recent, a smaller drawing, a stick figure of a man at a workbench, and beside him a stick figure child with a composition notebook, and above both of them, written in Lily's block letters, the repair shop, Rue de la Condamine. He looked at it for a long time. Then Lily came out of the bathroom and went to her room and called good night without stopping, and he said good night, and the apartment settled into its nighttime sounds. He washed the glass. He dried it. He put it away. He went to his room and sat on the edge of his bed. He thought about what Lily had said about Vanessa being lonely, and he thought about the specific honesty of children who see things adults have learned to look past. He thought about the session and the engineers and what Lily had said about false certainty. The cost of false certainty is that everyone follows you the wrong way. And he thought about all the ways that applied to things that were not engineering. He thought about the phone conversation he'd had with his brother 3 weeks ago, in which his brother had said, gently and with the slight awkwardness of a man not practiced at this kind of conversation, "Mason, you can stop now. The debt's paid. Whatever you think you owe Sophie by doing it alone, it's paid. You're allowed to have a life that's more than just you and Lily." He'd said, "I have a good life." His brother had said, "I know, I'm saying it could be bigger." He'd ended the call not long after that, not angrily, just because he didn't know what to do with what his brother had said, which was probably the truest thing anyone had said to him in a long time. And the truest things were often the hardest ones to sit with. He lay down. He looked at the ceiling. The ceiling had a small water stain in one corner from a leak 2 winters ago that he'd fixed but not painted over. He'd told himself he'd paint over it eventually. He'd been telling himself this for 20 months. He thought, follow the sequence. That's the lesson. Not certainty about the answer, certainty about the process. He thought, what's the sequence here? What happened in order? He closed his eyes. The sequence in order was a man who had a life he loved and a daughter he loved more, and a missing that he'd decided was simply the cost of having had something, and a phone call from a brother who saw it differently, and an afternoon where a 9-year-old had told a room full of engineers that the most important thing was not the answer, but the willingness to keep showing the thing you see, even when the room wasn't ready to see it. He lay there. He didn't sleep immediately, which was unusual for him. He was normally asleep within minutes of lying down, a habit of body that had developed in the years of early fatherhood when sleep was precious and the body learned to take it fast. Tonight he lay there. The building made its sounds. The street made its sounds. Monaco at night, which he knew so well by now that he no longer registered it consciously, only noticed it when it was absent. He thought about persistence as a diagnostic process. He thought about Lily's line, show it again even when you're starting to doubt yourself. He thought about the things you showed to rooms that weren't ready to see them, and the question of how many times you showed them before you stopped, and what the difference was between giving up at 2 and showing it a third time. He thought about this until the thinking became something slower and less organized, and then he slept. Simone found the structural compliance issue on a Wednesday. She sent Mason a text at 11:47 p.m., which told him something about the state she was in when she found it. People sent texts at midnight when the finding was too significant to wait and too specific to call. The text read, "You were right. High load, slow corners. Front left suspension upright showing 0.34 millimeters deflection under peak load. It's been affecting toe angle throughout the contact patch. We've been compensating with setup changes that were actually masking it. 3 races of data that makes a different kind of sense now. Thank you." Mason read it in the kitchen the next morning over the coffee that was, unlike the machine in his shop, genuinely good. A habit he'd developed 2 years ago when Lily had informed him, with the confidence of someone who had been listening to customer feedback in the shop, that the coffee he made at home was the kind of thing people apologize for. He'd bought a better machine. He'd learned to use it properly. Some improvements were worth making. He typed back, "Good catch. Tell Chen before you tell anyone else. Give him the chance to loop it into the development program properly." She replied within seconds, which meant she was already at her desk. Already did. He looked at the data for 20 minutes and then said, and started reorganizing his Thursday. Mason thought about Chen saying, He thought about the specific weight of that sound coming from David Chen, who was not a man who wasted syllables on things that didn't deserve them. He thought about 0.34 millimeters of suspension deflection across 3 races of data, and what that meant in tenths of seconds, and what tenths of seconds meant in points, and what points meant in championships. He put his phone in his pocket and went to open the shop. The morning was ordinary in the way that mornings in Monaco were ordinary. The particular quality of light that came off the harbor, the delivery vehicles that made the narrow streets their business before the tourists claimed them, the smell of something baked coming from the cafe on the corner. He rolled up the bay door and stood in it for a moment, drinking his coffee, looking at the street. He thought about his brother's phone call. He thought about the ceiling stain. He thought about lying awake following the sequence of his own life and arriving at questions he hadn't finished asking. He thought about Philippa Strand showing the data a third time, even when she was starting to doubt herself. He went inside and started the day. 3 weeks later, in mid-September, Vanessa called him on a Tuesday afternoon. Not a text, a call, which was unusual. They communicated mostly by text, the occasional email when something required documentation, rarely by phone. The phone meant something that didn't fit in a message. He was under a Volkswagen when she called. He came out, checked the screen, wiped his hands on a rag. "Vanessa, are you busy? I was under a car. Can you talk? Give me 2 minutes." He set down the rag. He walked to the back of the shop, to the narrow space with the metal chairs and the not good coffee machine and the shelf of journals. He sat in one of the chairs. "Okay. I need to tell you something, she said, and I want to say it properly rather than in a text. All right. She paused. Not long. Vanessa didn't do long pauses without reason. The structural compliance issue Simone found. The front left upright. Chen ran it backward through the season data, accounting for the masking effect of the setup changes they were using to compensate. We lost 0.4 per lap in specific conditions at 3 circuits. How many points does that translate to? Conservatively, 11, possibly 15. Another pause. We're currently 12 points ahead of Meridian in the Constructors' Championship. Mason was quiet. If the compliance issue had been found before the season started, or even mid-season, we'd be looking at a 23-point lead right now, potentially a championship that isn't this close. Her voice was level, which meant she was working to keep it level. You told me in May. You said chase the load, not the speed. I passed it to Simone. She found it 6 weeks later. 6 weeks is fast for a structural investigation. Mason, his name again, the way she said it, when she was setting aside the professional register and going somewhere more direct. I'm not calling to manage the narrative. I'm calling because you walked into my garage in Monaco 14 months ago, and you have been, since then, quietly changing the way this organization thinks about problems. And the cumulative effect of that is visible in the data now. Real points. Real championship margin. I wanted to say that to you directly. He looked at the shelf of journals, at the spine of the paper published 9 years ago, at the faded colored tape marking the pages he'd gone back to enough times that the tape had started to lose its adhesive. The engineers did the work, he said. I know they did. I'm not calling to give you credit instead of them. I'm calling because... She stopped. He heard her gather something. Because you made a choice 14 months ago to offer something you didn't have to offer, and you've kept making that choice every time I've asked. And I wanted to acknowledge that directly, person to person, not as a team principal to a consultant. I'm not a consultant. I know. That's part of what I'm acknowledging. He sat with this for a moment. Outside the back window, Monaco made its sounds. A gull somewhere, a motor somewhere else, the ordinary texture of an ordinary Tuesday. It matters to me that the paper exists, he said, not because of credit, because I spent 6 weeks writing something I thought was true and useful, and for 9 years it sat in a journal with 12 citations, most of them academic. And then in the last 14 months, I've watched Simone find a calibration error that was hiding in plain sight, and Rohan rebuild an alert hierarchy that was structurally flawed, and Philippa show something true to a room that wasn't ready to see it and keep showing it until they were. He paused. The paper didn't do that. The conversations did. I don't know how to account for that exactly, but it matters to me. It should matter to you. I'm not good at receiving that, he said. Just so you know. I noticed, she said. I'm telling you anyway. He almost said something deflecting. He stopped himself. His brother's voice in his head. The debt's paid. You're allowed to have a life that's more than just you and Lily. Thank you, he said. Just that. A pause. Was that hard? A little. Good, she said, and he could hear that she meant it without unkindness. One more thing. Okay? The season ends in 6 weeks, Abu Dhabi. If we hold the championship, and the way the math sits right now, we hold it if we score points in the last 2 races. I want you and Lily there, not as media, not as anything official, just there. She paused. Kai wants to meet you. He's been asking since Monaco. You told Kai about Monaco? Kai was sitting in the car when you found the fault. He knew someone fixed it. He asked questions. The paddock talks. A beat. He specifically said he wants to meet the man who asked what happened. Mason looked at his hands. Mechanic's hands. The same hands that had held a flashlight under car number 714 months ago, that had held the bleeding kit for Alain's Megane, that had written a note about a CV boot on a stranger's car at a service station while Lily watched. I'll ask Lily, he said. She'll say yes, Vanessa said. Probably, he said. But she gets to say it herself. Eat it. Lily said yes before he finished asking. She said yes with the specific quality of yes that meant she'd been wondering when he would ask, which meant she'd been thinking about it herself. She said, "Will I be able to talk to the engineers?" "Probably some of them." "Will Philippa be there?" "I can ask." She appeared to conduct an internal cost-benefit analysis. "Yes," she said, "and bring the camera. The real one, not the phone." He owned one decent camera, a second-hand mirrorless that he'd bought 3 years ago for no specific reason and had used to photograph Lily's school events and the occasional car that came through the shop and deserved documentation. Lily had appointed herself its primary operator sometime around age 8, with a thoroughness that had produced, over the past year, an archive of approximately 400 photographs of approximately 80% of which were genuinely good. He told her he'd bring the camera. He called Vanessa back and said yes. Abu Dhabi was hot in a way that Monaco was not. Not the damp Mediterranean heat of summer, but the dry architectural heat of the Gulf, the kind that came at you from every surface simultaneously, from the ground and the buildings and the air itself, with a commitment that felt almost personal. They arrived 2 days before the race, which Vanessa had arranged because she'd said there were things worth seeing before the circuit went into race mode pressure and stopped being anything except that. She was right. Lily spent the first day with a camera around her neck, photographing the circuit from every angle she could find access to. She photographed the pit lane at rest, the garages in their preparatory state, the barriers and runoff areas, and the specific architecture of a permanent circuit that had been designed to look like something from the future and had landed, in reality, somewhere between spectacular and strange. She photographed mechanics at work without asking their permission, which she'd learned from Mason produced more honest photographs than the kind where people knew you were taking one. She photographed Tobias Weir running a simulation check on a laptop with his shoes off, which he didn't know she'd taken until she showed him later, and which he said was the most accurate photograph of his working life that had ever existed. Vanessa walked the circuit with them on the first evening after the day's preparations had wound down. It was cooler after dark. Not cold, but bearable. And the circuit at night before a race had a specific quality that Mason hadn't been in the presence of for a long time. The grandstand's empty. The track surface lit by the circuit's lighting system, throwing everything into the high-contrast clarity of artificial light. The distant sound of the city outside the circuit walls, which in Abu Dhabi was the sound of something very large and very certain of itself. They walked the pit straight. Lily was quiet, which was unusual enough to register. "What are you thinking?" Mason asked her. "About the scale," she said. "In the drawings, it's all one size. Everything fits on a page." She looked at the pit lane, the length of it, the width. "It's bigger than you think when you're inside it." "Most things are," Vanessa said. Lily looked at her. "Is that a general statement or about this specifically?" "Both," Vanessa said. Lily took a photograph of the empty pit lane from ground level, the camera low, the shot looking down the length of it, the concrete stretching away under the lights into something that looked, in the image, like a statement about perspective. Mason saw her take it and thought, "She's going to want to print that one." They stopped near the end of the pit lane. The circuit curved away from them into the first corner, and beyond that the track disappeared behind a barrier and came back somewhere in the distance. The sound of the city continued, indifferent. "Can I ask you something?" Lily said. She was looking at the track. "Of course," Vanessa said. "Do you like it? Running the team. Not, do you think you're good at it? Do you actually like it?" Vanessa was quiet for a moment. Mason watched her receive the question, which she did the same way she received Lily's questions in general, without the defensive adjustment that adults usually made when a child asked something that sounded simple and wasn't. "Yes and no," Vanessa said. "I like the problem solving. I like when a team figures something out together that none of them could have figured out alone. I like being in a position where I can resource good ideas and remove obstacles for people who are smarter than me at their specific thing." She paused. "The parts I don't like are the parts where I have to manage things rather than work on them. The sponsorship politics, the media management, the decision-making by committee, when the committee has 19 different priorities and none of them align. But you do those parts anyway. Someone has to." "Is that why you do it? Because someone has to?" Vanessa looked at the track. Partly. And because my father built this and I didn't want it to be less than he made it. She was quiet for a moment. And because occasionally something happens that couldn't have happened without this exact organization existing and working the way it does, and that feels like enough. Like Monaco, Lily said. Like a lot of things since Monaco, Vanessa said. Lily took another photograph. The shutter click was the only sound for a moment. My dad says the missing is just part of having had something, Lily said. I think the same is true for the hard parts. The parts of your job you don't like. They're part of having the thing you do like. You can't have the problem solving without the committee meeting. No, Vanessa said, you can't. Does that make it easier, knowing that? On good days, she looked at Lily. On bad days, it just means you know why it's hard, which isn't the same as it being less hard. Lily appeared to find this satisfactory. Honest, at least, which she valued equally. She put the camera to her eye and took a photograph of the curve where the pit lane met the circuit, the exact point where the contained order of the garage world gave way to the track. Mason stood beside Vanessa and said nothing for a moment. The night was warm and the lights were bright, and the city hummed on all sides like something enormous breathing. She's going to be extraordinary, Vanessa said quietly. Not to him exactly, just into the space between them. She already is, he said. She just hasn't decided yet what she's going to be extraordinary at. Does she know about the shop? What it was before? She knows I worked in racing. She knows I left. She's never asked me to explain why beyond what I've told her. He put his hands in his pockets. I think she understands that some things don't need the full explanation, that the decision was what it was, and that the life after it was real. She understands that better than most adults. She's had to, he said. Simply. Without self-pity. Vanessa looked at him. He felt it without turning. Mason. Yeah. My father, before he died, he said something that I've thought about a lot since then. She said it carefully, the way you said things you'd carried a long time and wanted to say correctly. He said, the organization will outlast you. What you build inside it won't. So be careful what you're building. A pause. I've spent 8 years trying to understand what he meant. I think he was saying that the systems and the championships and the commercial relationships, those are the organization and they persist. But the way people think, the habits of mind you create in a team, the culture of how problems get approached, that's more fragile. It needs to be actively maintained or it disappears when you do. He sounds like he was a careful thinker, Mason said. He was. He was also difficult and demanding and right about most things in ways that were sometimes hard to be around. She almost smiled. The combination made him a good team principal and a complicated father. Yeah, Mason said. I understand that combination. She looked at him. Are you a complicated father? He thought about it honestly. I'm a father who made decisions that shaped Lily's life before she could decide anything, and who has tried to make those decisions worth the shaping. He paused. Whether that's complicated or just parenting, I genuinely don't know. I think it's both, Vanessa said. They stood there a moment longer. Lily had moved further down the pit lane and was crouching to get a low angle on something, the camera close to the ground, her posture the same focused, unbothered thing it always was. She does that like she was born doing it, Vanessa said. She taught herself, Mason said. I showed her how the camera worked. The seeing. That was hers. Quote. Kai Nakamura met Mason on the morning of the race day. He came into the garage where Mason and Lily were standing. Lily with the camera, Mason with his hands in his pockets, and the expression of someone trying to locate the appropriate version of being somewhere that had once been his world and was not anymore. And he was smaller than he looked on television, which was true of almost everyone who existed in high-definition broadcast and then appeared in person. He put his hand out. I've wanted to do this since Monaco, he said. Mason shook it. You drove well in the last 17 laps. Kai blinked. Vanessa told me you said that. It's still true. The car ran well after. He stopped. He looked at Mason with the specific expression of a driver looking at the person who made the car able to run. It was a look that Mason had seen before, in previous professional lives, and it had never been comfortable to receive. I didn't know what was happening in the garage. Nobody told me until afterward. I was just standing at the front of the car trying not to think about the clock. That's the right thing to be doing, Mason said. Let the engineers work. Your job is to be ready. Were you confident when you were looking? 70%. Kai looked at him. That's a narrow margin for what was at stake. It was the honest number. Mason looked at the car. The current version of it, the new chassis with the corrected floor compliance, and the new suspension geometry, gleaming in the Abu Dhabi morning under the overhead lights of the garage. 70% followed by following the sequence and looking where it led. That's all it was. And if you'd been wrong, then I'd have been wrong and you'd have withdrawn from the race and Meridian would have won the championship. He said it without drama. That's the other 30%. It doesn't disappear because the outcome was good. You just don't spend a lot of time on it afterward. Kai looked at the car. He had the look of a man running something through his mind. Not about the car, about the conversation. Lily had taken a photograph of the handshake without being asked. She took one of Kai looking at the car. She took one of Mason and Kai standing side by side looking at the car together, which she showed Mason later and which he looked at for a long time without saying anything. The two men standing in the same line of vision looking at the same object, and something in the geometry of it, the angle, the light, the particular way two people stood when they were thinking about the same thing from different positions, that made the photograph feel like it was about more than it showed. He asked her to send it to him. She did. He put it in a folder on his phone. He did not yet know what he would do with it. Blackwood Motorsport needed 5 points from the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix to mathematically secure the Constructors' Championship. Kai Nakamura started third on the grid, which was the result of a qualifying session that Mason had watched from the garage with Lily, who had spent the session asking Rohan Kapoor questions about the telemetry system and taking notes in the composition notebook until Rohan, with the expression of someone who has just agreed to something he'll spend the next hour figuring out, sat down beside her and started explaining the alert hierarchy he'd redesigned. Mason had watched this happen and thought, she's going to be an engineer, or a diagnostician of something. Whatever it is, she'll be good at it. She'll ask the right questions and follow the sequence and show the data again on the third time, even when she's starting to doubt herself. He thought, Sophie would have known this about her already. She would have seen it earlier and named it more precisely, and probably laughed about it the way Sophie laughed about things she recognized as inevitable. He thought about Sophie the way he thought about her now, 9 years later, not with the acute grief of the first years, which had been a different category of experience, something that took up space in the chest that he'd learned to breathe around rather than through. What remained was a more settled thing, a permanent presence of absence, which was not a paradox but a fact. The way weather was a fact. Something that shaped your days without being something you could change. He still missed her. He'd told Lily that the missing was part of having had something, and he'd meant it. He'd also meant that it didn't stop. You just learned to carry it in a way that didn't prevent you from putting your hands to other things. The race started at 5 in the afternoon, Abu Dhabi time. The light was already beginning to shift. This circuit finished in darkness, the city's own lights coming on as the race progressed, the atmosphere changing from the daylight intensity of the start to something that felt, by the final laps, like racing through an illuminated version of a city that was watching. Mason watched from the pit wall with Vanessa, which she'd arranged with the kind of quiet authority that didn't make the arranging visible. He stood where the engineers stood and watched the telemetry the way he watched telemetry, not parsing every parameter but looking at the shape of it, the overall health of the system, the places where something felt different from what it should. Lily was in the garage with Rohan, camera around her neck, watching the screens. Rohan had apparently accepted his role as her interpreter of racing telemetry with the resignation of someone who realizes he enjoys teaching more than he'd admitted to himself. Kai ran second for the first 20 laps. He ran third after a pit stop timing that worked out in the race leader's favor. He ran fourth for 6 laps when Meridian's first driver, Ferreira, made his undercut and came out ahead. And then, on lap 41, Ferreira made contact with the barrier at turn 9. Not a crash, a brush, slight front wing damage, and the subsequent pit stop to change the damaged wing dropped him to 7th. Kai moved to 3rd. The points position was clear. Third place at Abu Dhabi was worth 15 points, enough to secure the championship even if everything else stayed exactly as it was. Vanessa, beside him on the pit wall, did not visibly react to Ferreira's contact. She was on her radio, receiving information, processing it. Her face stayed level. He'd watched her do this in Monaco, and he was watching her do it now, and the thing he noticed, 14 months later, was that the level face was slightly different. Not less controlled, but less alone. She was still doing the thing she did, which was carrying the weight without showing it. But she looked like someone who had, in the past year, permitted herself to set the weight down occasionally. It showed in something small, the way her shoulders sat, the way she held the radio earpiece. Not the high-wire tension of Monaco, something with more floor under it. He wasn't sure if he was the reason for that, partially, in the way that people could be partial reasons for things in other people's lives. He thought maybe. He thought the conversations had done something, not just for the engineers, but for the person running the engineers. The person who had been watching from behind a window, as Lily had said, because she was used to being watched. The last 20 laps of the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix were not dramatic in the way Monaco had been dramatic. There was no crisis. There was no 23-minute window. There was a car running third on an illuminated circuit in the Gulf, managed with precision by a team that had spent a year learning to ask different questions. And the car did what well-engineered, well-understood machines did when everything had been found and fixed and properly known. It ran. When Kai crossed the finish line in third place, the championship numbers were confirmed immediately. The radio erupted. The garage erupted. Mason could hear it from the pit wall. The particular sound of a room full of people who had been holding something for 2 hours, finally letting it go. Vanessa pressed the radio button. Kai, well driven. Tell me the number, Kai said. 19 points, final margin. A sound on the radio, then, last year was 12. Last year we had a problem we didn't know about, Vanessa said. This year we found it. A pause. Then, give me the name of whoever fixed my car in Monaco. I shook his hand this morning, but I want to know properly. Mason Reed, she said. Former electrical systems engineer, currently runs a repair shop on Rue de la Condamine in Monaco. Is he there? He's standing next to me. She held the radio toward Mason. He took it. He held it to his mouth. Kai. Thank you, the driver said. Simple, unelaborated. The word of a man who had something genuine to say and trusted the word to carry it. You drove the car, Mason said. I just found the reason it could run. Same thing, from where I sit. Mason handed the radio back to Vanessa. She took it and looked at him and said nothing, which was, between them, a kind of communication they'd developed without naming it. He turned and walked back into the garage. He said, Lily was sitting on an equipment case with the camera in her lap, scrolling through the photographs she'd taken. She looked up when he came in. Did you hear? She said. I was there. Rohan cried a little, she said. He turned away, but I saw. Don't tell him you saw. I won't. She looked at the camera. I got a good one of the moment the lap count hit 0. The screens all showed the championship confirmed at the same time, and everyone in the garage turned and looked at each other. It was... She paused, trying to find the word. What? Like when you know something, and you're waiting for everyone else to know it too, and then they do, and the room changes. She looked at the photograph. She turned it toward him. It was genuinely a good photograph. The moment of collective recognition. 8 people in a garage all turning slightly at the same instant. The screens visible in the background with the championship confirmation, the expressions not yet fully processed into celebration, but caught in the second before, when everyone was just understanding what they understood. That's a very good photograph, he said. I know. She said it without arrogance, just honesty. She scrolled to the next one. I got the one of you and Kai this morning too, the standing looking at the car one. She tilted the screen toward him. He looked at it again. Same thing he'd felt when she'd first shown him. The 2 men in the same line of vision, looking at the same object, the geometry of it suggesting something the photograph didn't say directly. What do you think it's about? She asked. What do you mean? The photograph. What is it actually about? He thought about it honestly. I think it's about two people looking at the same thing from different positions and still seeing the same thing. Is that possible? Seeing the same thing from different positions? Sometimes, he said, when the thing is true enough. She considered this. She put the camera in her bag. She looked at the garage around her. The celebration still ongoing, champagne appearing from somewhere again, Chen with his arm around Priya again, Tobias on his phone taking a video, Rohan standing near the telemetry screens with the particular stillness of a man who has just had an experience he's going to need some time to process. I like it here, Lily said. Yeah? Not because it's exciting, because everyone here is trying to be right, and they're not afraid to be wrong in front of each other. She paused. That's unusual. It took work, he said. It wasn't always like this. Did you help? He thought about what Vanessa had said on the phone. The cumulative effect visible in the data. Real points. Real championship margin. A little, he said. She looked at him with the evaluative look. More than a little. Maybe. You're bad at receiving that, she said. I know. You should practice. He looked at his daughter, 9 years old, sitting on an equipment case in a Formula racing garage in Abu Dhabi with a composition notebook in her bag and a camera around her neck, and a better understanding of how rooms worked than most people he'd ever worked with. I'm practicing, he said. She appeared to find this acceptable. She hopped off the equipment case. Can we go find Vanessa? I want to show her the photograph. Yeah, let's go find her. They found Vanessa outside the garage in the post-race cooling area, in the specific moment between the race ending and the full celebration beginning, where the person responsible for the team sometimes stood for 60 seconds alone before the obligations resumed. She was looking at her phone, and she looked up when they approached. Lily held out the camera without preamble. The moment it was confirmed, she said, in the garage. Vanessa took the camera and looked at the screen. She was quiet for a moment. Something moved across her face. Not a large thing, but real. That's the team, she said. Yeah, Lily said. Can I send it to you? Please. Lily took the camera back and did the thing with her phone that resulted in the photograph going wherever it was supposed to go. Vanessa checked her phone and nodded. Thank you, she said. I have another one, Lily said. Of my dad and Kai this morning, looking at the car. She found it and held the camera out again. Vanessa looked at it for longer. She looked at Mason, then back at the photograph, then at Mason again. What do you think it's about? Lily asked. Vanessa looked at her. Did you ask your dad the same thing? Yes. What did he say? He said it was about two people seeing the same thing from different positions. Vanessa looked at the photograph a third time. I think it's about that, she said, and I think it's also about two people who both know what the other one chose not to have, and respecting that. Lily thought about this. That's more than my dad said. I had more time to think about it, Vanessa said. Lily took the camera back. She looked at the photograph herself for a moment. Then, is it okay that he chose not to have it? The team, the career. It's his choice to make, Vanessa said. I know, but is it okay from your side? Vanessa looked at Mason over Lily's head. He looked back. This was, he thought, the most direct version of a conversation they'd been having for 14 months in various forms, now being conducted through a 9-year-old with a camera and without any of the professional register that usually shaped their exchanges. Yes, Vanessa said. It's okay from my side. What he does instead is valuable, different and valuable. She paused. And he comes when I ask. That matters. Lily appeared to process this. She looked at her father. She means it, she said. The whole thing. I know, he said. Okay then. She put the camera strap over her shoulder. Can we get food? I've been thinking about dinner for 2 hours. They got food, a late dinner in the sort of restaurant that existed for the racing world's post-race needs, where the tables were full of people from 15 different teams speaking 7 languages over food that was decent, and portions that were large and service that had been doing this specific thing for race weekends long enough to be completely unfazed by any of it. Mason and Lily sat with Vanessa and eventually Chen and Simone, who found them and joined without formal invitation, which was its own evidence of something. Lily interrogated Simone about the structural compliance finding for 20 minutes, and Simone answered with the detail of someone who had spent 3 weeks finding something and was genuinely pleased to talk about it to someone who was going to listen completely. Chen ate his dinner with the quiet satisfaction of a man whose team had won a championship and who had personally found, with Mason's indirect assistance, a fault that the instruments hadn't been able to see. At one point, Chen looked across the table at Mason. "The paper," he said. "Just that." "Yeah," Mason said. "I read it this week. After the structural thing, I went and found it." He drank some water. "It's good. It's clearly right. I don't understand why it didn't get more uptake." "The industry moves fast," Mason said. I know that's the reason. I'm saying I don't understand why that's an acceptable reason." He set down the glass. "The things you've described to us in the sessions, the diagnostic blind spot, the assumption as a filter, the sequence over the theory, it should be part of every engineering curriculum in this sport, not an informal conversation twice a year. Standard. Standard is hard to maintain," Mason said. "It becomes routine. Routine becomes the thing people do without thinking about why." "So, how do you keep it alive?" Mason looked at Lily, who was deep in conversation with Simone about wind tunnel boundary conditions and the limits of computational simulation. She was making notes. She was asking the question underneath the question, the way she always did. "You need someone in the room who doesn't know what they're looking for," he said. "Not as a permanent state. You need the expertise. You need the trained eye. But occasionally, deliberately, someone who follows the sequence instead of the theory." "We have you for that," Chen said. "Twice a year," Mason said. "That's not enough for an organization of 300 people. "So what's the answer?" Mason thought about Lily asking Philippa how many times she'd shown the data, about Declan's rounding error and Yuna's hand calculation, about Tobias and the parameter he'd set wrong for 6 weeks, and the documentation he'd gone back to reread because something felt off. "Build it into the culture," he said. "Make the habit structural, not a checklist. Habits don't live in checklists. Make it a question you ask at the beginning of every diagnosis meeting. What are we assuming? Say it out loud. Every time until saying it out loud is the thing you do before you do anything else." "That sounds simple," Chen said. "It is simple. Simple things are hard to sustain." "Yeah," Mason said. "That's why you need someone who cares about sustaining them." He looked at Chen. "You care about it. That's not nothing." Chen looked at his plate. He had the expression of a man receiving something he didn't entirely know what to do with. He picked up his fork. "The championship margin was 19 points, he said. "I know. Last year it was 12. "I know. 7 of those points were from the structural compliance correction." "Simone found it," Mason said. "She did the work." "You told her where to look." Chen looked at him with the directness of a man who had decided to say the thing. "I was the one who dismissed what she was seeing, the 20% that didn't fit the damper model. I told her it was probably setup noise. She kept looking because you told her to chase the load." Mason was quiet. 7 points, Chen said. "In a 12-point championship, that's the difference. We don't know that the margin would have been 12 otherwise." "No, but the direction is clear." He set down his fork. "I wanted to say it directly. Not through Vanessa, not at a session, just here, to you." Mason looked at him. Chen was not a man who said things for effect, which meant this was the thing he actually thought. "Thank you," Mason said. He said it without the difficulty it had cost him when Vanessa said it on the phone. It came slightly easier. Practice. Chen nodded. He went back to his dinner. They flew back to Nice the following morning, the 3 of them, Mason and Lily and Vanessa, who was also on the flight because it was the most direct route, and the team's logistics had arranged it, which was either coincidence or one of those things that wasn't coincidence, but was arranged without being discussed. Lily fell asleep over the Mediterranean, which was becoming a pattern. The notebook was on the tray table in front of her, open to the last page she'd written on. Mason could see it from his seat. The page read, in her block letters, "What I learned at Abu Dhabi." 1. The organization outlasts you. What you build inside it won't. 2. Missing is part of having had something. The missing doesn't mean the leaving was wrong. 3. Sometimes two people see the same thing from different positions because the thing is true enough. 4. Simple things are hard to sustain. That's why they need someone who cares. 5. The answer isn't always hidden. Sometimes everyone just stops looking. Below the 5th point, she'd added a line in slightly different handwriting, faster, like it had been written quickly. The most important version? Be the person who looks again. Mason read this without her knowing he'd read it. He read it twice. He looked out the window at the sea below, the particular blue of the Mediterranean from altitude, which was not the blue of the sea from the shore. It was something else, something with depth behind it that you couldn't see from the surface. He thought about being the person who looked again. He thought about the paper published 9 years ago, about Monaco 14 months ago, about the sessions and the conversations and the engineers who had shifted, incrementally, toward a different quality of attention. He thought about Simone and the boundary condition and Rohan and the alert hierarchy and Philippa and the stress concentration and Bertrand, who had paired with a junior engineer and said, when she found the thing he'd been looking at and not seeing. He thought about his brother's phone call and the ceiling stain and lying awake following the sequence of his own life. He thought about what it meant to be the person who looked again. Not just in garages, not just in rooms with whiteboards and laptops, in the full accounting of a life. He'd spent 6 years building something small and good and real, which had been the right thing to do and which he did not regret. He'd spent those same 6 years telling himself that the boundary he'd drawn between what he'd left and what he'd kept was fixed, that it was the appropriate size, that the life on this side of it was sufficient. He thought, was he certain about this? Or was this the end plate? Was he a man with 16 years of expertise in the shape of the life he was supposed to have, looking at a symptom and fitting it to the familiar explanation, while somewhere behind a bracket he hadn't thought to check, the actual condition sat quietly, unchanged, waiting to be found? He did not arrive at an answer on the airplane. He was not the kind of person who arrived at answers on airplanes, but he followed the sequence. What happened? A life built in grief and love in equal parts, around a daughter who was extraordinary, and a shop that was real, and work that mattered in the particular way that quiet work mattered. Also, a paper nobody read for 9 years. Also, an engine firing. Also, conversations in rooms where engineers started asking different questions. Also, a woman who had said, on a phone call on a Tuesday in September, I wanted to acknowledge that directly, person to person, not as a team principal to a consultant. Also, his daughter, asleep beside him, with a notebook that said, be the person who looks again. What happened? In order. He looked where the sequence led. Vanessa was 3 rows ahead of him on the airplane, on the aisle seat, working on something on her laptop with the particular efficiency of someone who used travel time as work time because the alternative was not working, which was not a genuine alternative for her. He could see the side of her face from where he sat. Not fully, just the angle of her jaw and the line of her shoulder, and the small, involuntary things she did when she was working on something that was bothering her, which was a slight tightening of the jaw that he'd learned to read because he'd been watching her manage things for 14 months, and you learned people's tells if you paid attention. Something was bothering her. He thought, she's carrying something she's been carrying all season and probably longer, and she sets it down sometimes and picks it back up, and nobody in her organization fully knows it's there because that's how she's trained herself to operate. He thought, Lily was right. She doesn't have someone who listens to her the way he listened to Lily. He thought about the things he'd declined and the things he hadn't, and the difference between a boundary that protected something real and a boundary that had started as protection and become a habit. The airplane began its descent. The sea got closer. The coast of France appeared in the window, the specific geology of it, the way the land came down to the water with that quality of having been here so long it didn't need to announce itself. Mason looked at Lily. She was still asleep, the notebook in front of her, the camera bag at her feet. She looked like Sophie when she slept. The particular stillness of it, the way her face organized itself without any of the daytime alertness that was her default mode. He looked at her the way he looked at her sometimes when she didn't know, with the full weight of what she was to him, which was not something he performed or managed, just something that existed the way gravity existed. He thought, I have not been a man without love since Sophie died. I have been a man who directed all of it in one direction and called that being careful. He thought, follow the sequence. He thought, look where it leads. The plane landed in Nice at 11:40 a.m. local time. Lily woke when the wheels hit and assembled herself in the efficient way she had, closing the notebook and stowing it in her bag and straightening without drama, already oriented toward the next thing. They came off the plane into the terminal, the three of them, the particular transition from pressurized air to the specific quality of Mediterranean airport air that was different from everywhere else, even when it shouldn't be. In the terminal, Vanessa had a car waiting. She usually did. She traveled with the efficient infrastructure of a person whose time was systematically managed. She would go to the Blackwood operational office in Monaco for the afternoon. She had calls. She stopped near the exit. Mason and Lily stopped beside her. Safe travels, she said. Then to Lily, send me the other photographs when you've had a chance to go through them. I will, Lily said. She looked at her father, then back at Vanessa. You should come to the shop sometime, she said. Not for a meeting, just to see it. Vanessa looked at her. I'd like that. We have good coffee now, Lily said. My dad upgraded. I heard, Vanessa said, and looked at Mason with an expression that contained within its professional composure something that was genuinely warm and also slightly amused, and also something else that he recognized because he'd been carrying a version of it himself. He recognized it because it was the same thing he was carrying. Come by the shop, he said, whenever. He paused. He let the pause be a real pause, not a filled one. Not because of the work, just come by. She looked at him. Okay, she said. Just that. She got in her car. The car moved into the Nice traffic and disappeared in the direction of Monaco. Mason and Lily stood on the curb for a moment. She'll come, Lily said. Probably. Not probably. Definitely. She adjusted the camera bag on her shoulder. She just needed someone to look again. He looked at his daughter, 9 years old, Sophie's eyes, his stubbornness, her own entirely specific quality of seeing, which belonged to neither of them and had been hers from the beginning. Yeah, he said. You're right. They walked to his car parked in the short stay. They drove the familiar route back to Monaco, along the coast road that Lily knew as well as any road she'd ever traveled. She'd been driven this way since she was small enough to sleep in a car seat, and the sea and the rock and the particular architecture of the coast had become part of her geography of home. She didn't sleep this time. She looked out the window. Near the border, she said, Dad, what's the most important thing? He knew what she was asking. She'd asked variations of it before, for the school project, in the shop, in a dozen conversations over years. He'd given different answers at different times. He tried now to give the most honest one he had. Knowing what you're looking for, he said, and knowing when you've been looking for the wrong thing. She was quiet for a moment. How do you know when you've been looking for the wrong thing? When the data looks clean, but the problem's still there, he said. When all the sophisticated explanations don't add up. When someone asks a simple question and you don't have an answer. She looked out at the sea. And then? And then you get back on the floor, he said, with the flashlight, and you follow the sequence. She turned and looked at him, this girl who was made of his choices and her own nature and the space between them. Okay, she said. Okay, Dad. They drove home. The shop was where they'd left it. The bay door closed for the Abu Dhabi trip, the tools in the right places, the jobs waiting for Monday, the coffee machine on the counter, the drawing of the repair shop taped to the refrigerator with the magnet shaped like a car. The ordinary furniture of an ordinary life that was, in the ways that mattered, not ordinary at all. Mason unlocked the bay door and rolled it up. He stood in it for a moment, looking at the street, the way he did most mornings. The answer isn't always hidden. Sometimes everyone just stops looking. He picked up his tools. He started the day.